The mountain peaks stood like jagged teeth against a bruised purple sky, the air at 8,200 feet so thin it felt like inhaling needles. Up here in the high desert reaches of the Nevada range, the silence was usually absolute, broken only by the occasional whistle of the wind or the distant crack of a rifle. But today, the silence was heavy, thick with the invisible weight of failure. Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway stood in the shadow of the operations shack, his fingers hovering over the slick surface of a tactical tablet. His hand trembled, just a fraction, as he watched the final line of code vanish into the ether. It was a clean delete, a digital ghost disappearing from the range computer's architecture. For 3 long years, he had been the unseen architect of disappointment. He had watched the finest marksmen in the United States military, men who were more machine than human when it came to precision, crumble under the weight of inexplicable misses. Their confusion had been his currency. A soft chime signaled a notification on his private, encrypted device. He didn't need to look to know what it was. Another wire transfer had cleared, $50,000 settling into an offshore account that now held enough to buy him a new life in a country that didn't care about his service record. This month alone, he had earned more than the military had paid him in a decade. Holloway let out a short, bitter snort of a laugh, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the biting wind. He looked out through the reinforced glass at the 22 elite operators, standing in a perfect, miserable line on the firing ridge. These were the ghosts of the battlefield, the men whose reputations preceded them in every theater of war from the Hindu Kush to the streets of Ramadi. Today, those reputations were being systematically dismantled. 22 careers were being pushed to the brink of a nervous breakdown. He felt a cold, predatory satisfaction as he realized that within the hour, all 22 would be questioning every single hour of training they had ever endured. The foreign intelligence network that funded his betrayal had been clear about the goal. Identify the near-perfect, the operators who were just one step away from becoming legends, and break them. If you can't recruit them, destroy their confidence until they are useless to their country. Holloway had delivered every single time. He began to reach for the delete key one last time to clear the cache of his recent activities, but he stopped. The sound of boots on the gravel outside changed. It wasn't the rhythmic, heavy stomp of a soldier or the hurried pace of an aide. It was something else. A woman's voice, unnervingly steady and calm, echoed from the parking area. Then a dog barked. It wasn't the frantic yapping of a pet or the aggressive snarl of a sentry. It was a single, sharp, intelligent sound that felt like a question. Holloway's smile vanished. He felt a sudden, icy prickle of sweat at the base of his neck. His hand moved faster now, desperate to finish the purge, but the air in the room suddenly felt even thinner than the mountain atmosphere outside. Out on the range, the conditions were brutal. The temperature hovered at 41 degrees, cold enough to stiffen joints but not quite cold enough to cause shivering, a dangerous middle ground for a sniper. Every breath had to be deliberate, every heartbeat a timed event. Commander James Reeves walked the line, his boots crunching on the frost-dusted earth. His face was a map of every conflict the United States had engaged in over the last 30 years, weathered and carved from stone. He was a man who didn't believe in ghosts or bad luck, but his gut was churning with a feeling he couldn't identify. He had run this training facility for 15 years. He had seen the best and the worst, and he had never, not even once, seen a failure rate like this. It defied the laws of probability. It defied the laws of physics. Reeves stopped behind the first firing position. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble that cut through the wind like a knife. He reminded them of the data. The target was a steel silhouette at 4,000 meters, a distance that required a mastery of ballistics that bordered on the psychic. The wind speed, according to the state-of-the-art sensors dotting the valley, was 6 knots coming from the northeast. The barometric pressure was standard for this elevation. There were no excuses. Lieutenant Commander Davis, a man with 2 confirmed kills from over 3,800 meters in actual combat, was the first to settle into the dirt. His movements were a symphony of practiced efficiency. Beside him, his spotter, Jenkins, was a blur of mathematical precision, whispering numbers into his headset like a prayer. Jenkins ran the calculations a third time, his brow furrowed beneath his cap. Everything checked out. The sensors were green, the atmospheric data was stable, and the rifle was a masterpiece of engineering. The shot should have been textbook. Davis found that empty space between heartbeats, the silent void where a sniper truly lives. He exhaled, his body becoming part of the earth beneath him. The rifle cracked, a violent roar that echoed off the surrounding peaks. For 7 long seconds, the world held its breath. 7 seconds is an eternity when a bullet is in flight. It is enough time for a man to think about his family, his failures, and his God. When the dust finally settled near the target, the result was a physical blow to everyone watching. The bullet struck low and right, a full 6 feet off the mark. Davis didn't move. He stayed prone, his eyes still pressed to the glass, his mind frantically replaying the shot. He had accounted for the spin drift, the Coriolis effect, and the gentle breeze. He had been perfect. Jenkins looked at his tablet, his face pale. He ordered a recalculation, but the numbers didn't change. The second sniper, Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, stepped up with a jaw set so tight it looked like it might shatter. Rodriguez was a legend in the SEAL teams, a man who had never missed a qualification in 12 years of service. His preparation was methodical, almost religious. He treated his rifle like a holy relic. He fired. The result was worse, 8 feet low and left. The tension on the range began to solidify into something toxic. These were men who built their entire identities around the concept of precision. To miss by inches was a tragedy. To miss by feet was an existential crisis. One by one, the snipers took their turns. The third missed. The fourth missed. By the 10th failure, the atmosphere had shifted from professional frustration to something closer to a funeral. Men who had stood firm under heavy machine gun fire in the valleys of Afghanistan were now staring at their own hands as if they had betrayed them. They checked their scopes. They cleaned their barrels. And then they began to do the one thing a sniper can never afford to do. They began to doubt themselves. Inside the operations building, Holloway watched the feed, his pulse beginning to settle. He had the system under his thumb. He had implemented a smoothing algorithm that averaged out the sensor data over 30-second intervals. To the snipers and the commander, the wind looked steady and predictable. In reality, the high-altitude currents were dancing in chaotic microbursts that the sensors were intentionally ignoring. He emerged from the building, adjusting his cap to hide the satisfaction in his eyes, and approached Reeves. He offered a practiced look of professional concern, claiming that all diagnostics were green. He watched as Reeves, a man he had served under for years, looked like he was watching his world fall apart. Reeves pointed toward the dejected line of men. He asked for an explanation, but Holloway just shook his head, feigning ignorance. He was a predator in a uniform, hiding behind the mask of a loyal subordinate. He had been doing this for 3 years, identifying the operators who showed the most promise, and then crushing their spirits before they could be promoted to the highest echelons of national security. He watched Gunnery Sergeant Chen, perhaps the most naturally gifted shooter in the group, take his shot. Chen was a man who could hit a moving target in a sandstorm. When his bullet missed by 9 feet, the silence that followed was deafening. Chen didn't curse. He didn't look at his spotter. He simply stood up, his movements robotic, and walked away from the firing line. He kept walking, right past the staging area and down the mountain access road, a man whose soul had been hollowed out. Holloway offered to go after him, but before he could move, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew everyone's attention. A dusty, olive-drab Jeep groaned as it climbed the final steep grade to the range. It didn't have the markings of a high-ranking officer, but there was something about the way it was driven, steady, purposeful, and without a hint of hesitation, that commanded respect. It came to a stop 30 yards from the line. When the door opened, a woman stepped out. She wasn't imposing in height, maybe 5'6", but she had the lean, hard-edged look of a long-distance runner. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her eyes were the color of flint. She wore a standard Navy uniform, but there was no name tape, no unit patch, and no hint of where she had come from. Behind her, sitting in the passenger seat with a level of discipline that matched the soldiers on the range, was a German shepherd. The dog didn't bark as she stepped out. He simply watched, his amber eyes fixed on the horizon. Lieutenant Commander Davis muttered a question that everyone was thinking, but Holloway didn't join in the scoffing. He felt the blood drain from his face. He knew who she was, or at least he knew the legend. He had seen a file once, a digital ghost he had stumbled upon during a routine server audit. The name on the file had been Lena Cross. She was the person the Pentagon sent when the systems failed, when the experts were stumped, and when things were happening that weren't supposed to be possible. If she was here, his 3-year run was over. Cross approached Commander Reeves with an economical gait. She didn't salute, which in any other context would have been a grave insult, but here it felt like a statement of fact. She existed outside the standard chain of command. She spoke quietly, her voice carrying an authority that didn't need to be loud. She noted the 100% failure rate with a coldness that made the snipers flinch. Rodriguez, his pride wounded and raw, snapped back at her, suggesting the range was jinxed or the ammo was bad. Cross didn't argue. She simply tilted her head and said that was exactly why she was here. When asked what made her qualified to judge the best snipers in the world, she didn't point to herself. She pointed to the dog. Rex, the German shepherd, leaped from the jeep with a fluid grace that made him look less like an animal and more like a piece of high-end machinery. He sat at Cross's heel, his focus absolute. The snipers laughed, a bitter, mocking sound. They were looking for a technical explanation, a mechanical failure, or a ballistic anomaly. They weren't interested in a dog, but Cross ignored them. She watched Holloway, and more importantly, Rex watched Holloway. The dog's head turned, tracking the staff sergeant's subtle movements toward the operations building. A low, vibrating rumble started in the dog's chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, it was a notification. Cross placed a hand on the dog's head, calming him, but she didn't take her eyes off the traitor. Reeves was desperate enough to listen. He asked her what her plan was, and her answer was as cryptic as her arrival. She was going to listen to everything they were not. She walked past the firing line, Rex at her side, and stopped 50 yards out into the scrub and rock of the range. She closed her eyes and stood perfectly still. To the frustrated men behind her, she looked like she was meditating, a waste of precious time. But Rex was active. He wasn't sniffing the ground for scents. He was testing the air, his nose held high, his ears twitching with every shift in the atmosphere. After 2 minutes, Cross opened her eyes and pointed northeast. She claimed there was a fire miles away that had started within the last hour. Reeves checked his notifications. There were no reports of controlled burns or wildfires. But Cross explained that Rex wasn't looking for smoke. He was detecting pressure changes and thermal gradients. A fire of significant size creates an updraft, a massive column of rising heat that pulls air toward it. In a valley like this, that column acts like a vacuum, creating a secondary wind pattern at high altitudes that wouldn't show up on ground-level sensors. The snipers were skeptical, but they were starting to pay attention. If she was right, the bullet was traveling through a hidden weather system that none of their computers were programmed to see. Cross moved toward the operations building, insisting on seeing the raw data. Holloway tried to intercept her, offering to pull the files himself, but Reeves brushed him aside. The tension in the room was palpable as Cross looked at the monitors. She didn't touch the keys, she just read the scrolling numbers. She pointed out that the barometric pressure was too steady. At this elevation, with a thermal event nearby, there should be micro-fluctuations. The data was too perfect, which in her world meant it was a lie. Reeves, finally seeing the thread, bypassed the main interface and accessed the raw feeds. The truth was ugly. The wind wasn't 6 knots. It was a chaotic mess of 4 to 11 knots, shifting every few seconds. The realization hit Reeves like a physical blow. Someone had implemented a smoothing algorithm to hide the very variables that the snipers needed to succeed. He checked the system logs, his anger rising with every second. The authorization for the code change bore one name: Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway. Outside, Holloway realized the game was up. He didn't wait for a confrontation. He broke into a sprint toward the vehicle depot, hoping to reach a jeep and disappear into the mountain trails he knew so well. He didn't make it. Rex was a blur of fur and muscle, covering the ground with a speed that seemed impossible. The dog hit Holloway with the force of a car, pinning him to the gravel before the man could even reach for a door handle. As the snipers converged on the fallen traitor, the air was filled with a different kind of heat, the heat of betrayal. Holloway, his face pressed into the dirt, didn't beg for mercy. He spat out his justifications, complaining about a system that didn't value him, about a pension that wouldn't cover his rent. He admitted to selling out 47 names over 3 years, identifying the near-elite operators who were vulnerable to recruitment or elimination by foreign networks. The rage on the range was a living thing. Rodriguez and Davis had to be held back by their comrades. These were men who had trusted Holloway with their lives, their equipment, and their secrets. To find out he had been systematically destroying them for a paycheck was a betrayal that transcended the military code. But Cross remained calm. She didn't join the shouting. She simply watched as Holloway was dragged away to await a military prison. She looked back at the targets, the steel silhouettes mocking the men who had failed to hit them. Lieutenant Commander Davis, his voice now filled with a genuine, humbled respect, asked the question they all wanted to know. Could she make the shot? Could she do what 22 of the world's best could not? Cross didn't answer immediately. She consulted Rex, the two of them sharing a silent communication that seemed to transcend language. She said the wind would stabilize in 40 minutes, right at sunset, when the thermal column from the fire leveled out. The wait was the longest 40 minutes of Reeves' life. He watched this woman, this petty officer with no name tape, as she sat on a rock and waited for the world to align. He asked her about Rex, about how one trains a dog to detect electromagnetic fields and pressure gradients. Her answer was simple: you don't train it. You just learn to listen to what they are already saying. Humans had traded their instincts for instruments, but the world was still talking if you knew how to hear it. She explained that Rex didn't do anything supernatural. He just paid attention to reality while everyone else was distracted by their screens. When the sun dipped low enough to paint the valley in a deep, bloody crimson, Cross stood up. She didn't use a specialized rifle. She took the same M107 that the others had failed with. She settled into the dirt, her body becoming as still as the stone beneath her. Rex sat beside her, his ears forward, his body a living sensor. The snipers gathered around, their skepticism gone, replaced by a desperate need to see the impossible become possible. Cross didn't use a human spotter. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then Rex's ear twitched. She fired. The roar of the rifle seemed louder in the twilight. 7 seconds began. At the 3.5-second mark, Davis, watching through his own high-powered glass, saw the wind gust. It was a killer, a sudden shift that would have sent the bullet wide by 10 feet. Then Rex barked. It wasn't a random sound. It was a sharp, timed burst of acoustic energy. To the physicists in a lab, the idea that a dog's bark could influence a bullet's flight at 4,000 meters would be laughable. But in the chaotic, high-pressure environment of that mountain valley, the sound wave hit a specific thermal pocket at the exact moment the bullet passed through it. It was a microscopic correction, a nudge from the universe. The radio crackled to life, the voice of the range safety officer trembling with disbelief. Direct hit, dead center. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the morning. It was the silence of awe. Cross stood up, wiped the dust from her uniform, and prepared to leave. She hadn't just made a shot. She had reminded 22 men that they were more than the data on their screens. She had shown them that precision wasn't just about math. It was about connection, to the environment, to their instincts, and to the truth. As the military police arrived to take Holloway into the darkness, Reeves stood with Cross near her jeep. He asked her who she really was, but he knew he wouldn't get an answer. He looked at Rex, the dog who had seen the fire, sensed the traitor, and guided the bullet. Cross told him that Holloway was right about one thing: the system was broken, and there were more names on that list. But she also told him that the system didn't matter as much as the men standing on that ridge. She told him to teach them to listen again. As the jeep pulled away, disappearing into the shadows of the Nevada peaks, the 22 snipers stood on the firing line, looking out at the 4,000-meter target. They didn't look at their tablets. They didn't look at their watches. They just stood there, breathing the thin, cold air, and for the first time in a long time, they were actually listening. The aftermath of the day's events felt like a slow-motion collapse of a structure that had been rotting for years. While the snipers remained on the ridge, their world tilted on its axis. The operations building became a hive of frantic activity. Intelligence officers, who seemed to materialize out of the mountain mist within an hour of Reeves' call, were already stripping the servers and bagging Holloway's personal effects. The betrayal wasn't just a local issue. It was a systemic breach that threatened to unravel decades of quiet work. Holloway, now stripped of his dignity and his rank, sat in the back of a secure transport vehicle, his eyes fixed on the floor. He had been a phantom in their midst, a man who had traded the lives of his brothers for the hollow comfort of a bank balance. Captain Morrison, the lead intelligence officer, stood with Reeves in the center of the now-gutted operations room. The screens that had once displayed the smoothed data were dark, replaced by the scrolling green text of forensic recovery tools. Morrison's face was grim. He explained that Holloway's recruitment operation was more sophisticated than they had feared. He wasn't just looking for near-elite performers. He was looking for the cracks in the foundation of the American military spirit. He sought out the men who felt overlooked, the ones who had been passed over for promotions, and the ones whose personal lives were fraying under the pressure of constant deployment. He would offer them a way out, a golden parachute funded by interests that wanted nothing more than to see the United States lose its edge. Reeves listened, but his mind kept drifting back to the woman and the dog. He asked Morrison if he knew anything about Lena Cross. Morrison paused, his fingers hovering over a tablet. He looked around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then spoke in a voice so low it was barely a whisper. He told Reeves that Cross didn't exist in any official capacity. There were no payroll records, no enlistment papers, and no mission logs. She was part of a shadow program, an experimental unit that explored the intersection of human intuition and animal perception. They were the fail-safes, the ones sent in when the high-tech solutions failed, and the situation required a level of awareness that machines simply couldn't replicate. The names Holloway had sold, the 47 operators, were now the priority. Morrison revealed that of those 47, 14 were already unreachable. Some had retired under strange circumstances, 2 had disappeared while on leave, and several others had met with accidental deaths during training exercises. The magnitude of the loss was staggering. Holloway hadn't just been messing with range scores. He had been a spotter for a global assassination and recruitment network. Every time he identified a target, he was essentially painting a bullseye on a soldier's back. Reeves felt a wave of nausea. He had trusted Holloway. He had shared meals with the man, discussed tactical theories, and trusted him to maintain the very tools that kept his men alive. Outside, the sun had fully set, leaving the range in a state of deep, cold darkness. The 22 snipers hadn't left the ridge. They were gathered in small groups, talking in hushed tones. The bravado that usually defined them was gone, replaced by a sober, quiet intensity. Rodriguez was sitting on the bumper of a Humvee, staring at his rifle. He wasn't looking at the scope or the barrel, he was looking at his own hands. He realized now that his failure hadn't been a lack of skill, but a lack of awareness. He had allowed himself to become a slave to the data, a component in a machine that had been hacked. Davis approached Reeves, his face pale in the moonlight. He asked if the 47 names would be made public. Reeves shook his head. No, they would be handled internally, protected by teams they would never see, and moved to positions where they could be monitored. The damage was done, but the bleeding had to be stopped. Davis looked out toward the target, which was now just a dark shape against the darker hills. He mentioned the shot Cross had taken, the impossible hit at 4,000 meters. He asked Reeves if he believed the dog had really changed the air. Reeves didn't have an answer, but he told Davis that it didn't matter if it was physics or magic. What mattered was that Cross and Rex were in tune with a reality that the rest of them had forgotten how to see. As the night wore on, the logistical machinery of the military began to haul the pieces of the broken day away. Holloway was driven down the mountain, destined for a series of interrogations that would likely last for months. The intelligence teams packed their gear, leaving behind a facility that felt haunted. Reeves stood on the edge of the firing line one last time. He thought about the 3 years of sabotage, the 3 years of watching good men doubt themselves because of one man's greed. He realized that the greatest threat wasn't a foreign army or a sophisticated weapon system. It was the quiet, steady erosion of trust from within. He looked at the empty spot where Lena Cross's Jeep had been parked. She had appeared out of nowhere, shattered the illusion of their failure, and then disappeared back into the shadows. She had left them with a hard truth, that their technology was a shield, but it was also a blindfold. He pulled out his radio and called the remaining snipers together. They stood before him, 22 of the best the country had to offer, their faces lit by the dim glow of the operations building's emergency lights. He didn't give them a speech about duty or honor. He simply told them that starting tomorrow, the training would change. They would learn to shoot without the computers. They would learn to read the wind by the way it moved the grass. They would learn to trust their guts again. The men nodded, a collective understanding passing between them. They were no longer just shooters, they were students again. They had been broken, but in the breaking they had found a new kind of strength. As they began to clear the range, picking up spent casings and stowing their gear, the wind picked up, whistling through the rock formations. For the first time in years, Reeves didn't look at the wind speed indicator on his wrist. He just closed his eyes, felt the air against his skin, and listened. He heard the distant howl of a wolf, the rustle of the sagebrush, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of his men. He felt the mountain, solid and indifferent, beneath his feet. And for the first time that day, he felt like they might actually be okay. The story of Marcus Holloway's betrayal would eventually become a classified case study, a warning whispered in the halls of specialized training centers. The names of the 47 would be guarded like crown jewels. But on that quiet Nevada ridge, the legacy of that day wasn't the treachery or the investigation. It was the memory of a woman and a dog who had stood against the wind and seen the truth. It was the reminder that in a world of high-definition sensors and encrypted data, the most powerful tool ever created was the human spirit, especially when it was willing to listen to the things that couldn't be spoken. Reeves turned away from the range and walked toward his quarters, his boots echoing on the gravel. He had a lot of work to do. He had to rebuild a program, protect his men, and find a way to live with the knowledge that the enemy was sometimes the person standing right next to you. But as he looked up at the stars, clear and bright in the high-altitude air, he felt a strange sense of gratitude. He had seen the impossible. He had seen a bullet guided by a bark and a woman who lived in the spaces between the numbers. And he knew that as long as there were people like Lena Cross out there, the shadows would never fully win. In the weeks that followed, the range at 8,200 feet became a different kind of place. The high-tech sensors were still there, but they were no longer the final word. The snipers spent hours standing in the wind, eyes closed, learning the language of the mountain. They learned to feel the pressure changes in their sinuses, to hear the subtle shift in the wind's pitch before it hit their positions. They became hunters again, more attuned to the natural world than the digital one. And every now and then, when the wind was just right and the sun was setting over the jagged peaks, one of them would look toward the northeast, toward the place where a wildfire had once burned, and they would remember the day the world had opened up and shown them what they were truly capable of. The North Star Network, as Holloway had called it, was eventually dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. The information he provided in his desperate attempt for leniency led to the arrest of handlers in 3 different continents, and the exposure of dozens of other Holloways embedded in various branches of the service. It was a long, ugly process, but it was necessary. The military was purged of the rot, and the 47 names were brought back into the fold, their confidence restored by the knowledge that their failures had been the work of a master manipulator, not a lack of skill. But for James Reeves, the true victory was simpler. It was the sight of Lieutenant Commander Davis hitting a target at 3,000 meters with nothing but a spotter's eye and a feel for the air. It was the way Rodriguez no longer checked his tablet every 5 seconds. It was the way they all carried themselves, with a quiet, humble confidence that didn't need a computer to validate it. They were the elite once more, but this time, their foundation was built on something that couldn't be hacked. They were the ones who listened to everything others were not. And in the silence of the high Nevada desert, that was more than enough. The air inside the operations building was thick, heavy with the metallic scent of old filing cabinets, and the stale, recycled oxygen of a room that had seen too many late nights and too many grim revelations. Commander Reeves stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the harsh glare of the California sun, but his posture was slumped, the weight of the morning's discoveries pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Behind him, Morrison, the intelligence liaison whose face seemed carved from granite, continued his grim recitation of the facts. It wasn't just a breach, he explained. It was a harvest. They hadn't seen immediate red flags because there were none to see. This wasn't a sudden defection or a dramatic theft of secrets. It was gradual cultivation, a slow-growing rot that had been nurtured over years. Reeves felt his stomach turn as the implications settled in. He asked the question he already dreaded the answer to, his voice a low rasp. How many were successfully recruited? Morrison hesitated, a rare sign of uncertainty from a man who dealt in certainties. The pause lasted a heartbeat too long, an answer in its own right. They didn't know yet. They were still cross-referencing, digging through years of operational failures that had previously been written off as bad luck or poor intelligence. They were looking at equipment malfunctions in the field that had cost lives, and leaks that had sent teams into hornets' nests. Preliminary analysis was already suggesting that at least 12 operators in the SEAL teams alone had been compromised to some degree. And that was just the beginning. Holloway, the man they had once trusted to train their best, had tentacles that reached far beyond the teams. He had contacts in the Rangers, Delta Force, the CIA's Special Activities Center, and various internal affairs special operations groups. The room felt colder as the list went on. Cross sat at the table, her hands steady but her eyes narrowed, scanning the data as it scrolled across the monitor. She asked who was running him, but Morrison could only shake his head. That was the core of the problem. The contact listed in the encrypted files as North Star was a classic cutout, a digital ghost. The phone number they had recovered routed through 7 different countries and 3 separate dark web relay points. It was a masterpiece of obfuscation. While they were working the lead, the reality was stark. They would likely never identify the primary handler. This wasn't the work of some amateur contractor looking to pay off a gambling debt. This was a professional intelligence operation, a state-sponsored machine designed to hollow out the heart of the American military. While the humans talked, Rex, the Belgian Malinois whose instincts were often sharper than any sensor, had been exploring the perimeter of the room. He stopped suddenly at a heavy olive-drab file cabinet in the far corner. He didn't bark. He simply sat, his gaze fixed on the bottom drawer, then looked back at Cross with an intensity that demanded attention. Cross noticed the shift immediately. She asked what was in that cabinet, and Morrison checked his digital notes, dismissing it as general access personnel files, nothing classified, nothing that should be of interest. But Rex didn't move. He remained anchored to the spot, his ears forward, his body a coiled spring of focus. Cross stood up and moved toward the cabinet, the sound of her boots echoing on the linoleum floor. She opened the drawer Rex indicated, finding standard file folders, alphabetically organized. To the naked eye, it was exactly what it was supposed to be, mundane administrative paperwork. She began pulling the files out one by one, checking the spines and the contents, while Rex watched her every move. 15 files in, her hand stopped. The folder was labeled Range Maintenance Logs 2023 to 2024. It was a boring, innocuous title, the kind of thing no one would ever bother to audit. She flipped it open, and there, taped to the inside of the back cover, was a small, high-capacity USB drive. Morrison took the drive with gloved hands, his expression shifting from skepticism to grim focus. He moved to an isolated terminal, a sanitized machine designed specifically for examining hostile media without risking the network. The room went silent as the drive mounted. He ran the initial security scans, his fingers dancing across the keyboard, and then he accessed the contents. A soft, whispered profanity escaped his lips. The drive was a treasure trove of betrayal. It contained video files, dozens of them. There was surveillance footage from the range, from the operations building, even from the barracks where the operators slept. It was all focused on the snipers who trained there. But the footage wasn't the worst part. Each file was meticulously annotated with psychological assessments, personal observations, and vulnerability ratings. Reeves watched the screen, his voice dead and hollow. Holloway wasn't just training them, he was building dossiers. He was identifying the cracks in their armor, the personal demons they tried to hide, the financial pressures they struggled with. Morrison pointed out the file names. Each one included a price tag. It was a catalog. Holloway had been literally shopping the finest warriors the country had to offer to foreign intelligence services, putting a bounty on their loyalty. Cross's jaw tightened as she watched the assessments scroll by. They were sophisticated, far beyond what a standard instructor would be capable of producing. Someone had trained Holloway in advanced psychological evaluation. Someone had given him the frameworks needed to identify exploitable weaknesses. It meant he wasn't a lone wolf. He was a student, or perhaps he had been doing this for much longer than the 3 years they had initially suspected. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, but it wasn't because of the files. Rex's attention had moved from the cabinet to the door. His body went tense, his ears swiveling to catch a sound that was still beyond human hearing. He wasn't aggressive, but he was alert, his tail held low and still. A few seconds later, the distant rumble of an engine reached them. A vehicle was approaching the building. Reeves checked his phone, noting that it was likely the medical transport for Holloway. They were scheduled to take him to the brig at Coronado for a more intensive interrogation. Everything seemed routine, but Cross was already moving toward the door, her hand instinctively resting near her sidearm. Rex flanked her, his posture mirroring her own sudden caution. There was something in the way she moved that made the others follow without question. Outside, the mountain air was crisp and carried the scent of pine and dry earth. The medical transport was a standard-issue military ambulance, flanked by 2 military policemen who looked perfectly by the book. Holloway was secured in the backseat, his hands bound with heavy-duty zip ties. He looked broken, a shadow of the man who had stood on the range hours before. Everything was exactly as it should be, which was precisely why Cross stopped 30 feet away. She gave a low command to Rex, "Alert." The dog's posture changed instantly. His back arched, and a low, vibrating growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that felt like a warning from the earth itself. The two MPs reacted immediately, their hands moving toward their sidearms in a gesture of defensive alarm. Reeves, sensing the escalating tension, ordered them to stand down, then turned to Cross, asking what she saw. She didn't look at him, her eyes were scanning the vehicle, the men, and the surrounding terrain with predatory efficiency. Rex was detecting a threat, and in her world, Rex was never wrong. One of the MPs, a young man who looked slightly nervous, spoke up, his voice cracking just a fraction. He claimed they were just transport, following orders to move the prisoner. Cross didn't blink. She demanded to see those orders. The MP hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, a stutter in his mental rhythm, but it was enough. Cross saw it, Rex felt it, and in that moment the facade crumbled. The second MP's hand moved toward his holster, not with the practiced ease of a peace officer, but with the lethal intent of a predator. He wasn't fast enough. Cross was already moving, closing the distance with a speed that defied her calm exterior. Her voice cut through the air with the weight of absolute authority as she commanded them to stop. The MP froze, his hand halfway to his weapon, his body language screaming hostile intent. Cross didn't slow down. She told them they weren't MPs. Their uniforms were right, and the vehicle was a perfect match, but their gear told a different story. They were carrying M17s, the standard Army sidearm, rather than the M9s typically issued to Navy MPs at this station. More tellingly, their boots were high-end Oakleys, expensive civilian gear that no standard-issue MP would be wearing on a routine transport detail. They were too comfortable in their own gear and too uncomfortable in the roles they were playing. The fake MP's face twitched, his eyes darting toward his partner. He tried to claim she was insane, but the lie lacked conviction. Cross was 10 feet away now, her voice cold. She knew why they were there, to kill Holloway before he could talk. The only question was whether they were there to eliminate a liability or rescue an asset. Either way, she made it clear they weren't taking him anywhere. A silent decision passed between the two men, a grim realization that their cover was blown. They both drew their weapons. Rex launched himself before their fingers could even find the triggers. He hit the first man with the force of a battering ram, his jaws locking onto the man's gun arm with surgical precision, the weight of his body driving the fake MP to the ground. A shot discharged into the dirt as the man fell, and Rex adjusted his grip, dragging him away from the vehicle with savage efficiency. The second man managed to get his weapon up, swinging the barrel toward Cross, but she was already inside his guard. She moved with a fluid, choreographed violence, her hand seizing his wrist and redirecting the barrel toward the sky just as she drove her elbow into his solar plexus. The man folded, the air leaving his lungs in a wheezing gasp. With a practiced twist that surely shattered fingers, she stripped the weapon from his grip. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 seconds. The real snipers, hardened men who had seen combat across the globe, watched in a stunned silence that mirrored the aftermath of the impossible shot on the range. This was a different kind of impossible. It was close-quarters mastery, a display of skill so refined it looked like a dance. Cross secured both men with their own zip ties while Reeves called for actual base security, and Morrison began the process of documenting the scene. Torres, one of the younger snipers, asked how she had known. Cross looked at Rex, who was now standing over the first man, a silent sentinel of teeth and fur. She explained that she didn't know, Rex did. He had detected elevated cortisol levels and the chemical scent of stress hormones. Real MPs performing a routine transport wouldn't be that terrified, but men about to commit a double murder in front of elite witnesses certainly would be. She moved to the vehicle and checked on Holloway. He was staring at her with wide, panicked eyes, looking at her as if she were something supernatural, something that had stepped out of a nightmare to save his life. She told him they were going to kill him, but Holloway's response was a broken whisper. He claimed they were supposed to rescue him, to trade him out and give him a new identity and a new life. Then, a hollow, bitter laugh escaped him. He realized the truth as he sat there in the back of the ambulance. They were never going to let him live. They were going to kill him a mile down the road and make it look like an escape attempt. He was never meant to reach the interrogation room. The realization seemed to shatter what little resolve he had left. Cross studied him, her gaze piercing. She asked how many others there were, how many handlers and recruiters were embedded in the network. Holloway shook his head, explaining the compartmentalization of the operation. He only knew his contact, North Star. Every person was just a single link in a chain, kept in the dark about the rest. But Cross knew he was holding something back. The kill team hadn't been sent just because he might talk. They were sent because he had something they couldn't afford to lose. Holloway's resistance finally crumbled. He admitted there was a list, names, locations, and operational details. He had kept it as insurance, a bargaining chip to trade if he ever got caught. It was encrypted and hidden on a cloud server under a dummy corporate account. The handlers knew he had it, which was why they needed him dead. He tried to bargain, demanding full immunity and witness protection in exchange for the codes. Morrison stepped in, reminding him that he wasn't in a position to negotiate. But Holloway, desperate and cunning, shot back. The list contained active foreign intelligence assets embedded in the highest levels of the military and intelligence communities. If he died, the list died with him. He had set up a dead man's switch. If he didn't check in every 72 hours, the data would be wiped forever. Reeves and Morrison exchanged a look, the weight of the decision clear on their faces. They looked to Cross. Morrison admitted this was above his authority, that he needed to loop in the higher-ups. But Cross interrupted him, her voice sharp. There was no time. If the network had sent a kill team this quickly, they were monitoring everything. The moment the calls started going up the chain of command, the network would know their cleanup crew had failed. They would burn their assets and disappear. They needed the list now. She pulled out her own phone, a device that looked standard but carried encryption protocols that would have made a cryptographer weep. She made a single call, spoke 3 short sentences, and listened for 10 seconds. When she hung up, she told Holloway he had conditional immunity. If the information was accurate, he would get protection. If he lied, he would face charges of treason. Holloway closed his eyes and gave up the account. Cascade Holdings, LLC. The password was a complex string of characters, and the 2-factor authentication went to a burner phone hidden in his apartment, though he provided the backup email override. As Morrison worked the laptop, establishing an isolated network to access the server, the room held its breath. The list loaded, and the scale of the betrayal was even worse than they had feared. It wasn't 47 names, it was 83. 83 operators across every branch of special operations, the CIA and the NSA. Each name was accompanied by a detailed dossier, recruitment status, contact protocols, and current assignments. Morrison breathed a prayer of disbelief. It was the largest penetration of U.S. special operations in history. Reeves scanned the names, his face turning a ghostly white. Some of the people on that list were active right now, leading teams on sensitive deployments. One was a squadron commander. Another was attached to a presidential security detail. Morrison's first instinct was to lock it all down, to pull every person on that list and investigate them immediately. But Cross countered him. Such a massive move would tip off the network instantly. They would realize the list had been compromised, and the handlers would vanish, likely killing their assets to silence them. She suggested a different approach, one that relied on shadows rather than force. They would feed the network false information, making them believe Holloway was dead and the kill team had succeeded. They would leak the news through compromised channels and watch who reacted. Meanwhile, they would investigate the list quietly, one asset at a time, building airtight cases without alerting the hive. It would take months, but it was the only way to ensure the network didn't just reconstitute itself elsewhere. Cross began highlighting names on the screen, identifying the 12 highest-risk assets who were in positions to cause immediate, catastrophic damage. These people needed to be rotated to new assignments under plausible covers and monitored around the clock. One of the names she highlighted was Captain First Class Michael Chen. Reeves felt a chill in his chest. He had known Chen for 8 years. The man was solid, a rock in the SEAL community, but as Cross read from the file, the truth was laid bare. Chen had been under cultivation for 14 months. The network had found his breaking point: a messy divorce, resentment over being passed for promotion, and a daughter diagnosed with leukemia. When the treatment costs exceeded his insurance, the network had stepped in, disguised as a charitable foundation. They had used his love for his child to turn him into a traitor. The room was silent as the betrayal of a brother-in-arms sank in. Torres, who had been listening from the periphery, mentioned that Chen had returned to the range 20 minutes ago, saying he needed to speak with Reeves. He had last been seen heading toward the barracks. Cross didn't wait for the rest of the sentence. She was out the door, Rex at her side, her movements a blur of focused energy. The snipers followed, their training taking over as the situation shifted from an investigation to a life-and-death intervention. They covered the quarter-mile to the barracks at a dead run. Cross hit the door and Rex surged inside, his nose leading the way through the sterile corridors. He stopped at the third door on the left and sat, his silence more telling than a bark. Cross pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit. Chen sat on the edge of his bunk, his service pistol in his hands, the barrel pressed against his own temple. Tears were streaming down his face, and his eyes were hollow with a despair that no training could overcome. He told them not to come closer. He knew why they were there, and he knew what he had become. Cross didn't move toward him, but she didn't back away either. She spoke to him with a calm, steady voice, asking him what he thought he was. Chen's voice was a wrecked thing as he called himself a traitor and a sellout. He confessed to taking the money, at first thinking it was just a donation to save his daughter. But the demands had escalated. Small things first, then training schedules, then personnel rosters. He had told himself it wasn't really betrayal, but the weight of the lies had become a mountain he could no longer climb. Reeves appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of grief. He started to speak, but Cross held up a hand, silencing him. She focused on Chen, asking about his daughter, Emma. She spoke her name, bringing the reality of the child into the room. She described the cost of the experimental treatment and the way the network had used it to bind him. She called him a father who had done what fathers do. He had protected his child, even if it meant betraying everything else he held dear. Chen laughed, a sound like breaking glass, calling himself a monster, but Cross disagreed. She called him human. She took a single step forward, asking if any of the information he gave had led to deaths. Chen didn't know. He had given them schedules and evaluations, never knowing how they were used, but the guilt was eating him alive. Rex moved closer, his presence a stabilizing force in the room. He sat just a few feet from Chen, calm and steady. Cross shared a piece of herself then, a story from her own past. She told him about a mission in Kandahar where a split-second decision had cost the lives of 6 civilians. She told him how she still saw their faces and how she had to choose every single morning whether to let that tragedy define her or to do better. She told him that pulling the trigger wasn't honor, it was an escape. If he died, Emma would lose her father, and the people who had exploited him would celebrate because another loose end had been tied up. She offered him a third option, to help them burn the network down, to give them everything, the contacts, the protocols, the money trails. She told him he could make sure what happened to him never happened to another operator. The gun clattered to the floor as Chen buried his face in his hands and sobbled. Rex moved to his side, resting his head on the man's knee, offering the silent, non-judgmental comfort that only an animal can. Cross sat beside him, promising that he wouldn't face the consequences alone. Morrison appeared, having secured a deal with NCIS. In exchange for full cooperation, Chen would receive reduced charges, and Emma's treatment would be covered by a legitimate DoD emergency fund. He would serve time, but he would live to see his daughter grow up. Chen looked up, his face ravaged, and asked why they would help him. Morrison's answer was cold but honest. Chen was a symptom of a larger disease, and they needed him to understand how to cure it. As Chen began to pull himself together, a new piece of information emerged. He mentioned that his handler had recently been asking specific questions about Tier 1 operator rotations and embassy security protocols. They were looking for gaps in diplomatic protection during transitions. Morrison realized the gravity of the intelligence. It was pre-operational gathering. They were planning an attack, possibly an assassination of a high-value target. Cross identified 3 potential targets in the next 6 weeks: a peace summit in Geneva, a trade negotiation in Singapore, and a memorial service in Arlington. Morrison wanted to lock them all down, but Cross knew that would alert the network. They needed to know the specific target and the method of attack. She looked at Chen and told him he was going back to work. He would maintain his cover as a compromised asset, and when his handler made contact, he would find out exactly what was being planned. The transition was jarring. The broken man who had been ready to end his life was replaced by the operator he was meant to be. Chen agreed to the plan, his resolve hardening. They drove to his apartment, an anonymous complex that offered the perfect backdrop for a man living a double life. Cross and Rex rode with him, while Morrison and Reeves followed in an unmarked SUV, their gear ready to monitor every sound. Inside the apartment, the walls were covered with photos of Emma, a smiling girl with a pink headscarf. The sight of her seemed to give Chen the strength he needed. He retrieved the burner phone from a shoebox in his closet and turned it on. The device vibrated with a flurry of messages, the most recent one an urgent demand for contact. The network knew something was wrong. Cross dictated a response, having Chen claim the base was in a security lockdown because of Holloway's arrest. He requested an urgent meeting to share information. The response came back in seconds, a meeting at a hiking trail overlook in 1 hour. The handler's message carried a veiled threat against Emma. They reached the trailhead at dusk, the parking lot filled with ordinary people enjoying the sunset, unaware of the life and death struggle unfolding around them. Chen started up the trail alone, while Cross and Rex took a parallel path through the brush, moving like shadows. The hike was a test of nerves. Chen's breathing was heavy, his heart rate spiking as he approached the overlook. Rex monitored him through the trees, his senses tuned to the man's fear. At the top of the trail, a man stood watching the valley. He was the picture of an unremarkable civilian, fit and well-dressed in expensive outdoor gear. This was the handler, a man whose job was to manipulate the souls of warriors. Chen approached, his voice steady despite the terror thrumming in his veins. He played the part perfectly, telling the handler that the base was in chaos and that Holloway had been caught. The handler watched him, his eyes cold and calculating, weighing Chen's loyalty against the risks. He asked what Holloway had given up, and Chen admitted he didn't know, but that the investigation was widening. He played on his fear for Emma, making his desperation feel real because it was real. The handler studied him for a long, agonizing moment. Cross watched through a scope from the brush, her finger light on the trigger, waiting for the signal. The air was still, the only sound the distant call of a bird and the soft rustle of the wind through the pines. The handler finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. He needed to know if Chen was still on their side, or if he had become a liability. The game of shadows had reached its tipping point, and the fate of the entire network hung on the next few words spoken in the fading light of the California sun. The handler's silence was a physical weight. He paced a short arc near the edge of the rocky outcropping, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. Chen stood his ground, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, one of them gripping the burner phone like a talisman. He looked exactly like a man on the verge of a breakdown which required very little acting. The wire picked up the handler's rhythmic breathing, a calm contrast to the frantic thud of Chen's heart. Finally, the man stopped pacing. He turned back to Chen, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. He asked if Chen remembered the first time they met, the way they had promised that Emma would always be taken care of. It was a reminder of the leash they held him on, a psychological tug to see if the collar still fit. Chen nodded, his voice thick with emotion as he told them he remembered every single cent. He reminded the handler that the money was the only reason he was still standing there. The handler seemed satisfied, or at least convinced enough to proceed. He lowered his voice, forcing Chen to step closer into the center of the overlook. He began to outline the next phase. They weren't interested in the range anymore or the training schedules. They needed something much more specific. He asked about the upcoming memorial service in Arlington, specifically the arrival protocols for the Joint Chiefs and the specific placement of the counter-sniper teams. Through the earpiece, Cross felt a jolt of cold clarity. Arlington, the memorial service for fallen operators, wasn't just a gathering of grief. It was a concentration of the highest military leadership in the country. The target wasn't just a person. It was the heart of the command structure. The handler was asking for the one thing that would allow an assassin to bypass the most elite security in the world. Chen hesitated, a perfect beat of feigned reluctance. He told the handler that the security for that event was locked down tight, that even he didn't have full access to the positioning yet. The handler's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine anger crossing his face. He told Chen that was why they were paying him, to get that access. He gave him a deadline, 48 hours to deliver the final security blueprints and the radio frequencies for the Secret Service detail. He stepped closer to Chen, his hand coming up to rest on Chen's shoulder in a gesture that was more threat than comfort. He told him that if the information was good, Emma's next 3 years of treatment would be paid in full up front. But if he failed, or if he tried to run, there would be nowhere on earth they couldn't find him. He squeezed Chen's shoulder once hard, and then turned away, disappearing into the shadows of the trail that led down the other side of the mountain. Chen stood alone on the overlook for a long time, his body shaking with the aftershocks of the encounter. Rex emerged from the brush first, his tail giving a single low wag as he nudged Chen's hand with his wet nose. Cross followed, her face a mask of grim determination. They had what they needed. The target was confirmed, the timeline was set, and for the first time in this long, bloody game, they were the ones holding the cards. They started back down the trail in the dark, the lights of the valley below looking like a field of fallen stars, a reminder of the world they were fighting to protect. The handler's voice was as cold as the mountain air, cutting through the silence of the forest with a clinical detachment that made Michael Chen's skin crawl. For a long moment, the man just stared at Chen, his eyes 2 chips of flint reflecting the gray, overcast sky. The wind rattled the skeletal branches of the nearby oak trees, a lonely, desolate sound that seemed to echo the emptiness in Chen's chest. "The treatment money will arrive on schedule," the handler finally said, his words measured and precise. "But I need something from you first. I need proof that you're still committed despite the pressure you've been under lately." Chen felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine, despite the biting chill. He tried to keep his hands from shaking, tried to maintain the facade of the loyal asset, but the weight of the double life he was leading felt like it was finally beginning to crush him. "What kind of proof?" he asked, his voice sounding thin and brittle even to his own ears. He thought of his daughter, Emma, lying in that sterile hospital bed, her breathing assisted by machines, her life measured out in the drips of an Roman IV bag that cost more than he made in a year. Everything he did, every lie he told, every secret he sold was for her. The handler stepped closer, invading Chen's personal space. The scent of expensive tobacco and something metallic clung to him. "There's a security briefing scheduled for Monday at Coronado," the man said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. "It concerns the personnel assignments for an upcoming diplomatic protection detail. High-level stuff, Michael. I need the complete roster, the assignment rotations, and most importantly, the vulnerability assessments. I want everything discussed in that briefing. Every word, every contingency, every perceived weakness." Chen's face went pale, and for the first time in months it wasn't an act. The blood seemed to drain from his extremities, leaving him lightheaded. "That's classified," he stammered, his mind racing. "That's top secret. I don't even have access to that briefing. I'm not on the distribution list for that level of operational intelligence. It's restricted to senior leadership and the immediate protection team." The handler's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Then get access," he said, the command as sharp as a razor. "You have 3 days, that's your window, not a second more." "That's impossible," Chen whispered, the word catching in his throat. "You're asking for the keys to the kingdom. If I even poke around the digital perimeter of that briefing, the red flags will start flying. NCIS, internal security, they'll be on me in an hour. It's a suicide mission." The handler reached out and gripped Chen's shoulder, his fingers digging into the muscle with surprising strength. "Nothing's impossible when your daughter's life depends on it," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly, frigid tone. "You've been useful, Michael. Very useful. We appreciate the training schedules, the petty evaluations, the administrative fluff. But useful only goes so far in this business. I need to know you're committed enough to take real risks. I need to know you're one of us, not just a man with a sick child. This is that test. Pass it and Emma gets her treatment. The next phase of her clinical trial is already funded, waiting for my signal. Fail and we both know what happens. She'll be moved to a state facility by Friday. We both know she doesn't have the strength for that." The threat was naked, stripped of any pretense. Chen looked at the man, seeing the monster behind the suit. "You're asking me to commit actual treason," he said, the reality of the situation finally crystallizing. "What I've given you before was minor. It was gray area stuff. This is operational intelligence that could get people killed. Real people, my colleagues, people I've served with." "Yes," the handler said simply, a terrifyingly casual affirmation. "It is." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the implications of the choice laid before him. The world seemed to shrink down to this single, desperate moment on a forest overlook. Chen felt the eyes of the handler boring into him, But he didn't know that there was another set of eyes watching them from the shadows. 500 yards away, nestled into a thicket of mountain laurel, Special Agent Cross watched the exchange through the high-powered optics of her long-range rifle. Her breathing was slow and rhythmic, the way she'd been trained. Beside her, Rex, the Belgian Malinois who was more a partner than a dog, lay perfectly still. His ears were forward, his body a coiled spring of muscle and intent. He didn't make a sound, but Cross could feel the vibration of his low, focused energy through the ground. Her finger hovered near the trigger, not because she had orders to fire, but because she was ready to end the threat if the handler made a move toward violence. She saw the fear in Chen's posture, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of the handler's hand. "Why this briefing?" Chen asked, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "Why now? What are you planning that requires the vulnerability assessments of a diplomatic detail? Are you targeting someone?" "That's not your concern," the handler snapped. "Your concern is Emma. Your concern is making sure she has a future. Everything else, the politics, the casualties, the strategic objectives, is secondary. I don't pay you to think about the big picture, Michael. I pay you to provide the brushstrokes. I need to know what this information will be used for. I need to know I'm not." Before Chen could finish the sentence, the handler moved with the speed of a striking cobra. He closed the distance, his hand shooting out to grab the lapels of Chen's jacket, yanking the smaller man off his feet. The suddenness of the movement sent a jolt of adrenaline through Cross, her eye pressing tighter against the scope. Rex let out a breathy huff, a warning signal she felt rather than heard. "You don't need to know anything." The handler hissed, his face inches from Chen's. "You need to know that your daughter lives or dies based on your cooperation. That is the only equation that matters. That is the only reality you are allowed to inhabit. Are we clear? Do I need to repeat the consequences for you, or has the reality of your situation finally penetrated that thick, sentimental skull?" Chen nodded frantically, his face a mask of genuine terror. He wasn't acting anymore. The fear was real, a raw, primal thing that stripped away his dignity. The handler held him for a beat longer, then released him with a contemptuous shove. Chen stumbled back, nearly tripping over a tree root. 3 days, the handler repeated, smoothing the front of his own coat as if the physical altercation had never happened. "The roster, the rotations, the assessments. You deliver, or Emma's next treatment gets delayed indefinitely. And we both know her heart can't take any more delays." The man didn't wait for another word. He turned on his heel and walked away, his movements fluid and efficient as he disappeared into the dense forest without a single backward glance. He vanished into the greenery like a ghost, leaving the silence to reclaim the overlook. Chen stood frozen for a full minute after the man had left. His breathing was ragged, great gasps of cold air that seemed to do nothing to settle his racing heart. Then, as if the strength had finally left his legs, he stumbled to the edge of the rocky overlook and vomited into the bushes below. The sound of his retching was the only thing that broke the stillness of the mountain morning. Cross emerged from the brush a few moments later, moving with a silent, predatory grace. Rex was at her side, his harness jingling softly. She kept her weapon lowered but ready, her eyes scanning the tree line where the handler had vanished. Morrison's team was already in motion, invisible but omnipresent. High above, silent drones tracked the handler's heat signature through the canopy, feeding thermal imagery to mobile units positioned on the perimeter of the forest. They were letting him run, but they were keeping the leash tight. "I can't do this," Chen said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand as he turned to face Cross. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "I can't give them that briefing." "You heard him. They are looking for vulnerabilities. They are looking for a way in. People will die if I do this." "You're not going to give them anything," Cross said, her voice steady and calming. She walked up to him, Rex sensing the man's distress and nudging his hand with a cold nose. "We're going to feed them exactly what we want them to know. False information that leads them into a trap. We're going to give them a map to a treasure that doesn't exist." Morrison jogged up the trail a moment later, his tactical boots crunching on the dry needles. He was looking at his phone, his face illuminated by the blue glow of a mapping app. "He's heading toward a vehicle parked 2 miles north," Morrison said, his voice clipped and professional. "A black sedan, tinted windows. We've got eyes on it now. We're running the license plate through every database we have. This is good, Chen. You did exactly what we needed. You stayed in the pocket. You gave us the hook." "He knows what he's doing," Chen said, his voice sounding dead. "He wasn't just threatening me. He was dissecting me. He knew exactly how to manipulate me." Every word was calculated to exploit my fear for Emma, and the worst part is, it worked. Even knowing you were there, even knowing I'm being played by both sides, I still feel like I have to protect her at any cost. I still feel like I'd burn the world down to keep her alive. That's what makes you human, Cross said softly. And that's what makes this approach so effective for people like him. They don't recruit ideologues or fanatics anymore. Those people are too unpredictable. They recruit people with vulnerabilities. They find the thing you love most and they turn it into a cage. They exploit those vulnerabilities until your own survival and the survival of those you love becomes dependent on your betrayal. Morrison's phone buzzed with a notification. He checked it and his expression darkened significantly. The vehicle is registered to a diplomatic mission, he said, looking up at Cross. The Russian consulate in San Francisco. Cross let out a short, sharp breath. Of course he does, she muttered. Which means he has diplomatic immunity. We can't arrest him, we can't interrogate him, we can't even officially acknowledge we know who he is without triggering a massive international incident. He's untouchable by normal legal means. So what do we do? Chen asked, looking between the two agents. If you can't arrest him, how does this end? We let him think he won, Cross said, her eyes flashing with a cold light. You get assigned to that briefing on Monday. We'll make sure it looks like a routine personnel shift. And when you attend, you pass along the information that Morrison's team has specifically crafted to mislead their operational planning. We're going to give them a masterpiece of misinformation. Morrison was already working his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen as he coordinated with NCIS and the Department of Defense. I'm pulling the strings now to get Chen's name on that roster, he said. We'll manufacture a reason, an illness in the primary team, a sudden opening. It'll look natural. Meanwhile, our analysts are going to craft the intelligence. False vulnerability windows, fake personnel rotations, and manufactured weak points that are actually hardened traps. We're going to make their planned attack target the wrong location at the wrong time with the wrong assumptions about our security. And when they realize it's false, Chen asked, a tremor returning to his voice. What then? They won't just go away. They'll come back for me. They'll assume it was bad intelligence, not deliberate misinformation, Cross explained. You're too valuable an asset to burn over one bad report. In their world, intelligence is a fluid thing. They'll blame their own analysis, or they'll assume the briefing changed after you reported it. They'll think the security detail adapted to a perceived threat. They'll keep you on the hook because they've already invested so much in you. Cross was watching the forest again. Rex hadn't relaxed. The dog was still alert, his attention focused intensely in the direction the handler had gone. His body was rigid, the fur along his spine standing up. Something's wrong, Cross said, her hand going to the grip of her sidearm. What is it? Morrison asked, looking around. Rex is still indicating a threat. The handler left, he's miles away by now, but Rex isn't standing down. He's smelling something we aren't seeing. Morrison checked his phone again, his brow furrowing. Thermals are clear for 1,000 yards. No other heat signatures in the immediate area except for us and some local wildlife. Maybe he's just keyed up from the handler? Rex's body went suddenly, terrifyingly rigid. A sound erupted from his throat, not a bark, but a deep guttural vibration that Cross had only heard twice before. Both times it had been seconds before someone tried to kill her. Down, Cross screamed. She didn't wait for a response. She tackled Chen, driving him off the exposed overlook point and into the dirt just as the first gunshot cracked across the valley. The sound was a sharp, whip-like snap that echoed off the granite cliffs. The bullet hit the exact spot where Chen's head had been a fraction of a second earlier, the stone exploding in a shower of gray fragments and dust. Morrison dove behind a nearby boulder, his weapon drawn in an instant, his eyes scanning the tree line with frantic precision. Sniper, he shouted into his radio. We've got a sniper in the trees, approximate range 400 meters, direction northeast. We are taking effective fire. Another shot rang out. This one hit the boulder Morrison was using for cover, the impact sending sparks flying. The angle of the strike told Cross everything she needed to know. The shooter wasn't trying to kill them immediately. If he had wanted them dead, he would have waited for a clearer shot. He was pinning them down. It's a distraction, Cross said, pulling Chen further behind a rocky outcropping. The handler's extraction. They knew we'd follow him, so they positioned a sniper to cover his escape. They aren't trying to assassinate a federal witness. They're buying time for their officer to get to the extraction point. Rex was already moving. Before Cross could even issue a command, the dog was a blur of tan and black, sprinting into the forest toward the sniper's suspected position. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible for an animal of his size, weaving through the underbrush like a phantom. Cross went after him, her instincts taking over, leaving Morrison to protect the cowering Chen. "Cross, wait for backup," Morrison shouted, his voice disappearing into the wind. But Cross was already gone, flowing through the brush with the same deadly efficiency as her partner. She didn't run in a straight line, her movements jagged and unpredictable. The sniper fired twice more, but the shots were aimed at Morrison's position, trying to keep the other agent from providing suppressive fire. It meant the shooter either didn't see her moving through the dense foliage, or he was following a specific set of rules that didn't include killing federal agents unless they were a direct threat to his mission. Rex stopped suddenly, 20 yards ahead of her. His body language shifted instantly from the pursuit phase to high alert. Cross froze, reading the signals she had spent years learning. The dog's head was tilted, his ears swiveling forward, his entire focus narrowed down to a single point 30 yards ahead and 15 feet off the ground. A tree stand. The shooter had set up a prepared position. It was a professional setup, likely days in the making. It gave him a clear sightline of the overlook while keeping him hidden in the canopy. It also meant he had an escape route already planned. Cross pulled her sidearm, moving to a position where she had a clear sightline through the trees. She didn't want to kill the man if she could avoid it. She wanted the intelligence in his head. "Federal agent," she called out, her voice echoing through the woods. "You're surrounded. Throw down your weapon and climb down slowly. You have nowhere to go." The response was immediate and violent. 3 rapid-fire shots tore through the leaves in her general direction. It was warning fire, not aimed to kill, but designed to establish that surrender wasn't an option. Then she heard a sound that made her heart sink. A mechanical whir, high-pitched and fast. A zip line. The sniper was already extracting. He'd used a prepared escape system that ran from his tree stand down to a vehicle position probably a quarter-mile away, deeper in the valley. By the time Cross could reposition herself to intercept him on the ground, he'd be long gone, his tracks covered by the very terrain they were standing on. But Rex had other ideas. The dog didn't wait for a command. He launched himself at a fallen log, using the angled wood as a natural ramp, and leaped into the air with a terrifying displays of athleticism. He caught the zipline's guide cable in his powerful jaws mid-deployment. 65 pounds of German Shepherd hit the steel cable like a heavy anchor. The sudden weight shift threw off the sniper's balance just as he clipped his harness onto the line. The man let out a cry of surprise as the tension on the cable snapped, sending him tumbling from his perch. He hit the ground hard, 15 feet below, rolling through the dead leaves and dirt. Rex was on him before he could even begin to recover. The dog's jaws locked onto the barrel of the sniper's rifle, dragging it away with violent, bone-jarring head shakes that dislodged the weapon from the man's stunned grip. Cross arrived seconds later, her weapon trained on the downed man's chest. "Hands where I can see them. Now." The sniper complied, his chest heaving as he gasped for air, but his eyes weren't on Cross. They were on Rex, who was standing over the discarded rifle, his lips pulled back in a silent, menacing snarl. The man was calculating his odds, his eyes darting toward the sidearm holstered at his hip. Cross saw the thought forming in his mind and answered it before he could act. "Don't even try it," she said, her voice like ice. "He's faster than you can imagine, and he's trained to kill on command. Your choice is very simple. Cooperate and live to see a courtroom, or resist and discover exactly how effective a military working dog is at close-quarters combat. He will tear your throat out before you can clear leather." The man's hands stayed visible, his fingers splayed against the forest floor. "Diplomatic immunity," he said, his voice thick with a Russian accent. "I am attached to the consulate. You have no authority to detain me." "I don't care who you're attached to," Cross interrupted, her eyes never leaving his. "You just attempted to murder a federal witness and fired on federal agents. Whatever immunity you think you have doesn't cover attempted homicide on U.S. soil. You're coming with us." Morrison arrived a few minutes later with the backup teams, 4 agents with weapons drawn and tactical gear gleaming in the filtered sunlight. They secured the sniper with heavy-duty zip ties while Cross checked his pockets for identification. Sure enough, his credentials identified him as a member of the Russian consulate in San Francisco. He was likely SVR, Russia's foreign intelligence service, operating under a thin veil of diplomatic cover. "This is a mistake," the sniper said as they hauled him to his feet. You are creating an international incident. My government will not look kindly on this provocation. You created the incident when you started shooting at us from a tree, Morrison replied, his face hard. Anything you want to tell us about your handler friend? About what you're planning with that diplomatic briefing? The sniper smiled, a cold, professional expression that didn't reach his eyes. I want my lawyer and my consulate representative. Until then, I have nothing to say to you. They processed him quickly, calling for additional security to transport him to a secure facility. But Cross knew they'd get nothing from the interrogation. The man was a professional, trained, committed, and protected by layers of protocol that would make prosecution a legal nightmare. Back at the Overlook, Chen sat on a stump with his head in his hands. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving him shaking and exhausted. He looked up as Cross approached Rex sitting faithfully at her side. They tried to kill me, Chen said, his voice barely a whisper. They wanted that information so badly they were willing to murder me to make sure I stayed quiet if I was compromised. Or they wanted to send a message to their other assets, Cross added, sitting down on a nearby rock. Cooperate or die. In their world, there is no third option. They don't value loyalty, they value compliance. How do I live with this? Chen asked, looking at her with hollow eyes. How do I wake up every day knowing I'm part of a system that treats human lives like disposable tools? How do I look Emma in the eye knowing what I've done? Cross was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade from the valley below. The shadows were lengthening, swallowing the trees in a creeping darkness. You don't live with it, she said finally. You live through it. You do the work that needs doing. You help us dismantle this network, and you accept that redemption isn't about being forgiven for what you did. It's about making different choices going forward. It's about ensuring that the people who manipulated you can't do it to anyone else. Chen looked at her, searching her face for some sign of insincerity. Do you really believe that? Or are you just saying it because it's what I need to hear to keep me functional? I believe it because it's the only thing that keeps me functional, Cross said, her voice surprisingly soft. I've done things in the field that would get me court-martialed if the full details ever came to light. I've made calls that got good people killed, and I've made calls that saved people I probably shouldn't have prioritized. Every one of those decisions sits in my chest like a piece of broken glass. But I keep working because the alternative is giving up. And giving up means all those mistakes were for nothing. It means the monsters win. She stood up and offered Chen her hand. You're going to that briefing, Michael. You're going to pass the false intelligence that saves lives. And you're going to help us identify every other asset in this network so they can be stopped before they hurt more people. That's your path forward. It's not clean, it's not heroic, but it's what you've got. Chen took her hand and let her pull him up. And Emma, he asked, what happens to her while I'm doing all this? If they suspect I've turned, she's the first person they'll go after. Morrison stepped in, having finished his calls. Emma's treatment is covered, he said firmly. Guaranteed. I've already processed the paperwork through a legitimate DoD medical assistance program. It's a special carve-out for high-value intelligence sources. She's protected regardless of what happens to you or this investigation. That's not leverage anymore. That's not a threat they can use against you. Something in Chen's expression seemed to crack open. Relief so profound it looked like physical pain washed over his face. You're sure? He asked, his voice breaking. You're absolutely sure she's covered? I'm sure, Morrison said. The first payment process is Monday morning. Every treatment cycle after that is automatic. Emma's safe, Michael. You can stop running for them now. Chen sat back down, not because his legs gave out, but because the weight he'd been carrying for years finally lifted enough for him to notice how exhausted he truly was. I thought I'd have to choose, he whispered, between saving her and doing the right thing. I thought those were mutually exclusive. They were, Cross said, looking down at Rex, until we made them not be. That's what teamwork actually means. Solving problems together that individuals can't solve alone. Morrison's phone buzzed again. He checked it, and his face went tight with renewed tension. We've got a development, he said. The handler's vehicle was tracked to San Francisco International Airport. He boarded a diplomatic flight to Moscow 20 minutes ago. We can't touch him. He's gone. But we know who he is now, Cross said, her mind already moving to the next phase of the operation. We know his operational methods, his manipulation techniques, and his pressure points. That's intelligence we can use to dismantle the rest of his cell. And the sniper? Chen asked. Being processed into federal custody, Morrison said. His diplomatic credentials are being challenged on the grounds that attempted murder of federal agents falls outside protected activities. It'll be a long legal fight, but we're holding him for now. He's not going anywhere. Cross pulled out her own phone, checking a message that had just arrived from their analytical team. Her expression changed, becoming somehow more focused and more distant simultaneously. "What is it?" Morrison asked, noticing the shift in her energy. "Confirmation on the target event," Cross said, her voice dropping an octave. "The attack they're planning. It's the Arlington Memorial Service." Morrison went pale. "That's in 3 weeks," he breathed. 50 Tier 1 operators are attending. We're talking about SEAL Team 6 leadership, Delta Force commanders, the Secretary of Defense. If they hit that with a compromised security detail, it would decapitate U.S. Special Operations leadership in a single afternoon. Cross finished. Which is exactly the point. This isn't just about intelligence gathering anymore. This is about eliminating the people who would respond to whatever larger operation they are planning next. This is the setup for a much bigger play. Chen stood up fast, his eyes wide as the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. "The questions my handler asked, the ones about transition windows and experience gaps, they're planning to hit during the personnel rotations. They want to strike when the most experienced operators are all in one place, making the remaining security teams at their weakest. It's a force multiplication strategy," Morrison said, thinking out loud. "Kill the leaders, fragment the teams, create operational chaos during a critical window, and then exploit that chaos for something bigger. A land grab, an invasion, a political coup. The possibilities are endless once you remove the top tier of the resistance." Cross was already moving toward the vehicles, Rex at her heel. "We need to accelerate the timeline," she said. 3 weeks isn't enough time to fully investigate 83 separate assets, build legal cases, and secure the memorial. We need to force their hand earlier. We need to make them commit to their attack plan before they are fully ready." "How?" Morrison asked, jogging to keep up with her long strides. "We leak information that the memorial has been moved up," Cross said. "We make them think they have 48 hours instead of 3 weeks. They'll rush, they'll make mistakes. They'll rely on assets they haven't fully vetted, and we'll be waiting for them." They reached the subs, and Morrison was already coordinating with his team leaders over his headset. "That's incredibly risky," he said. "If we're wrong about their target or their timing, we could trigger a premature attack we aren't prepared for. We could be walking right into a slaughter. Or we could wait 3 weeks and face an attack they've had time to perfect," Cross countered, her hand on the door of the lead vehicle. "I'll take rushed and sloppy over polished and professional any day of the week." Chen climbed into the back of the SUV, his voice quiet but steady. "Use me," he said. "If they are rushing the timeline, my handler will need immediate confirmation from his assets on the ground. I can feed him the false information. I can make it look urgent and credible. I can be the one who lures them out." Morrison considered this for a long moment, then nodded. "We craft a message. Time-sensitive operational change. Memorial moved up for security reasons. New assignments and rotations effective immediately. You pass it to your handler through the usual channels, and we monitor who reacts and how. Meanwhile," Cross added, "we identify which of those 83 assets are positioned to actually participate in an attack. Not everyone on that list is operational. Some are just informants. We need to find the ones with access to weapons, explosives, and tactical capabilities. We need to find the wolves." The drive back to the base took 40 minutes, and every second of it was spent in intense planning. Morrison's team pulled the files on all 83 compromised assets, cross-referencing their current assignments, skill sets, and psychological profiles. By the time they reached the operations building, they'd narrowed the list down to 17 operators who had both the capability and the positioning to participate in an attack on the Arlington Memorial. Reeves was waiting for them in the command center, his face drawn and tired. "Tell me you got something useful from that meeting," he said, gesturing toward the wall of monitors. "We got confirmation on the target and the timeline," Morrison said, stepping up to the main console. "And we've got a plan to accelerate their operational window. But it's going to require resources and authority that I don't technically have on my own." "What do you need?" Reeves asked. "Full surveillance on 17 Tier 1 operators without alerting them or their commands," Morrison said. "We need real-time monitoring of their communications, their financial transactions, and their travel patterns. And I need the authority to detain them without charges if any of them make moves consistent with attack preparation." Reeves sat down heavily, the weight of the request apparent in the slump of his shoulders. You're talking about treating some of our best operators as enemy combatants on U.S. soil, he said softly. You're talking about a legal and ethical minefield. I'm talking about stopping an attack that could kill 50 of our even better operators, Morrison replied, his voice firm. The math isn't pretty, sir, but it's clear. If we don't act, we lose the leadership of the entire special operations community. Cross pulled up the list of 17 names on the main screen. The profiles flickered into view. 5 SEALs, 4 Rangers, 3 Delta operators, 2 Air Force Special Tactics officers, 2 Marine Raiders, and 1 CIA Special Activities Center officer. Each one was a decorated veteran with years of exemplary service. Each one had been compromised by circumstances, debt, family issues, or psychological trauma that made them vulnerable to the handler's manipulation. These aren't traitors, Torres said, looking at the list from the back of the room. He and the other snipers had followed them back to the base, invested in the outcome. These are people who got exploited. It doesn't matter what we call them if they kill 50 people at Arlington, Rodriguez said quietly. His earlier hostility toward Cross had transformed into a grim respect. We stop them first. We can sort out the morality and the motives later. Cross looked at Rex, and the dog looked back with that uncanny intelligence that seemed to pierce through the noise of the room. Rex and I will take point on the surveillance, she said. We can identify behavioral changes, stress markers, and preparation activities that standard electronic surveillance might miss. You can't surveil 17 targets simultaneously, Reeves pointed out. No, but I can identify which ones are actively preparing versus which ones are passively waiting, Cross explained. Rex reads cortisol levels, adrenaline spikes, and fear responses. People who are getting ready to commit an act of extreme violence have specific physiological signatures. We find those signatures, and we find our active threats. We narrow the field. Morrison was already coordinating with the NCIS, the FBI, and military intelligence. The machinery of national security was grinding into motion, moving faster than normal protocols allowed because the timeline demanded it. The room was a hive of activity, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and ozone from the electronics. Chen sat at a terminal, his fingers hovering over the keys as he drafted the message that would trigger everything. His hands were steady now, the shaking replaced by the focused determination of a man who had finally chosen a side. How should I word this? He asked. What makes it credible enough that they'll rush their planning without suspecting a setup? Cross read over his shoulder, making quick suggestions. Make it look like it came from your normal intelligence gathering, she said. Mention that you overheard the change in a briefing, that the official announcement isn't public yet, and that you're taking a massive risk to report it early. Give them just enough detail to verify through their other sources, but make the timeline tight enough that they feel they have to act now or lose the opportunity forever. Chen typed, revised, and typed again. The final message was a masterpiece of desperate urgency. Memorial service moved to this weekend. Security concerns following recent arrests. New protection detail assignments effective 0600 tomorrow. Rotations and vulnerabilities same as original planning but compressed timeline. Can provide full roster if needed urgently. Risk level maximum for this contact. He read it aloud 3 times, checking for any hint of coaching. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he sent it through the encrypted messaging app to the handler's last known contact number. The message showed as delivered. 30 seconds later, it showed as read. Everyone in the operations building held their breath. The silence was absolute, the only sound the faint hum of the server racks. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. Morrison's phone buzzed. We've got activity, he announced, his voice tight. 3 of the 17 assets just received encrypted messages within the last 60 seconds. Different senders, different protocols, but the timing is too coincidental to be anything but a reaction. They're activating their network, Cross said. Which 3? Morrison checked his screen. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb and Chief Sarah Vance at Coronado, and Captain James Riggs from Delta at Fort Bragg. All 3 have expertise in explosives and close-quarters combat. All 3 were originally scheduled to be at the Arlington Memorial in 3 weeks. Pull their communications, Cross ordered. I want to know who they're talking to, where they're going, and what they're carrying. The net is tightening. The surveillance intensified. Drones hovered over Coronado and Fort Bragg, listening devices were remotely activated in vehicles, and tracking software began mapping every digital footstep. The 17 suspects became the most monitored people in the country, and none of them had any idea. Chen's phone buzzed with a response from the handler. Confirm roster, verify timeline, require in-person meeting for details. Tomorrow 0800, same location. Chen looked at Cross. He wants another meeting tomorrow morning. He's pushing back. He's testing you again, Cross said. He wants to see if you'll take the risk during daylight hours when surveillance is easier to detect. It's a final loyalty check before they commit their resources to the attack. What do I say? You say yes, Cross said. We need to maintain your cover until we've identified every member of the active cell. The moment they suspect you're compromised, they'll scatter like roaches, and we'll lose the chance to roll up the entire operation. Chen typed his confirmation, and the die was cast. Tomorrow morning at 0800, he would face the handler again, knowing that the safety of the entire special operations community rested on his ability to lie one last time. Outside the operations building, the mountain range sat quiet under the stars. The 22 snipers who had failed their test earlier that day gathered in small groups, talking in low voices as they processed what they had seen. Davis found Torres standing alone, looking out at the target that was still 4,000 meters away in the darkness. You believe what we saw today? Davis asked. The shot, the dog, the way she moved. Torres didn't look away from the distance. I believe we've been training for the wrong thing, he said finally. We've been learning to be perfect within systems we trust. But Cross, she's learned how to function when every system is compromised. That's a different kind of perfect. You think we can learn it? I don't know, Torres said, but after today I know we better try, because the world she operates in, the threats she faces, they aren't going away, and our perfect shots won't mean much if we can't tell who the real enemy is. Inside, Cross stood with Rex beside Chen. They all understood that the next move belonged to Russian intelligence, but the counter-move belonged to them. They were a woman, a dog, and a broken operator who had decided that redemption was a goal worth dying for. The night before the meeting, Cross didn't sleep. She sat in the command center, her eyes fixed on the surveillance feeds, watching for the patterns that the algorithms might miss. At 0230 hours, one of those patterns emerged. Morrison, she called out, look at this. Morrison came over, a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hand. What am I looking at? Cross pointed to a split-screen footage of Webb and Vance, the two SEALs at Coronado. Watched their movement patterns over the last 6 hours. Webb left the base at 1800, went to a gym in downtown San Diego, worked out for 90 minutes and then went back. Standard routine, right? Looks like it. Except Vance was at the same gym at the same time, Cross said, playing the footage. They never made eye contact. They never even stood in the same room. But look at the parking lot. She switched to a traffic camera view of the intersection outside the gym. Webb's vehicle stopped at a red light. 2 cars behind him, Vance's vehicle waited. As the light turned green, Webb's passenger window lowered slightly. Something small, a flash of white, was tossed into a storm drain. Vance's window lowered a moment later. A dead drop, Morrison whispered. They're coordinating without any direct contact. They're using high-level tradecraft. And look at this, Cross said, zooming in. A man dressed as a homeless person retrieved the object 5 minutes later. A third-party courier. If they're using this level of operational security for internal communications, they're definitely planning something active. Information-gathering assets don't need dead drops. Rex's head came up suddenly, his ears swiveling toward the door. 3 seconds later, Reeves walked in, looking like he'd aged a decade in a single night. Please tell me you have good news, he said. We have confirmation that the network is mobilizing, Cross said. Chen's false information is working. They're biting. And the bad news. If they're mobilizing this quickly, they already had most of the infrastructure in place, Cross explained. Dead drops, cutouts, secure protocols. That doesn't happen overnight. They've been planning a strike for months. We're just forcing them to execute before they've finished their final checks. Reeves sat down, rubbing his eyes. How many of the 17 do we think are actually going to pull a trigger? Based on the last 8 hours, we've identified 6 active operatives, Morrison said, pulling up their files. Webb and Vance in San Diego, Captain Riggs at Bragg, Staff Sergeant David Okonkwo, a Marine raider currently on leave, Lieutenant Emma Sullivan, Air Force Special Tactics, and Major Thomas Bradley, a CIA officer currently on medical leave in the D.C. area. 6 professionals, Reeves muttered. Any idea what the plan is specifically? We intercepted a heavily coded message from Webb's phone, Cross said. Our cryptographers pulled out 3 words, Sunday, package, and monument. Sunday is tomorrow, Morrison said, his voice dropping. If they are accelerating the timeline to match Chen's false report, then they're planning to hit tomorrow. But there is no memorial tomorrow, Reeves pointed out. The actual event isn't for weeks, which means they're either going to realize it's a trap and abort, Cross said, or they're going to attack anyway to prove they can. A demonstration of capability. They'll hit a symbolic target to show that no one is safe. Reeves grabbed his phone. I'm calling the Pentagon. We need Arlington locked down immediately. K9 sweeps, perimeter security, the whole works. That tips our hand, Morrison warned. The moment we lock down Arlington without a public event, they'll know the intelligence was compromised. They'll vanish. So what's the alternative? Reeves asked. We let them attack. We let them come, Cross said, her eyes narrowing as a plan formed. But not to Arlington. We create a false target that matches their intelligence. A completely controlled environment where we dictate the terms of the engagement. Where? Cross pulled up a map of the D.C. area. The Marine Corps War Memorial at Iwo Jima. It's close to Arlington, symbolic and isolated enough that we can control every approach. We stage a fake memorial service. We staff it with federal agents in military dress. We make it look like a high-value gathering. They'll have surveillance on the location before they strike, Reeves said. If it doesn't look authentic, they'll walk away. Then we make it perfect, Cross said. Chen meets his handler in 4 hours. He feeds him the exact details of this new memorial. The timing, the security gaps, the specific officers attending. We make it so detailed they can't afford not to believe it. And if the handler suspects something? Morrison asked. Then Rex will tell us, Cross said, looking at her partner. He reads deception better than any machine. If the handler is buying the story, Rex will stay calm. If he suspects a trap, Rex will alert us and we pull Chen out before things get ugly. Reeves checked his watch. It's 0300. The meeting is at 0800. That gives us 5 hours to stage an entire memorial service and create an authentic environment that can fool the SVR. I've done more with less time, Cross said, standing up. But I need full authority to coordinate resources without waiting for the paperwork. Every minute we spend on bureaucracy is a minute we're not preparing. Reeves picked up his phone and dialed a number that Cross knew went straight to the top. The conversation was short and blunt. Confirmed, sir, Reeves said. Full authority granted. He hung up and looked at Cross. You've got the green light. The secretary and the director just authorized unrestricted resource access for the next 24 hours. The floor is yours, Agent Cross. Let's go catch some wolves. The ticking of the clock wasn't just a sound. It was a physical weight pressing down on every person in the room. 72 hours. It was an impossibly narrow window to orchestrate a theater of deception that had to be flawless. Cross sat in the dimly lit command center, her eyes tracing the digital maps of Northern Virginia and the District of Columbia. Beside her, Rex was a silent shadow, his breathing the only steady rhythm in a room fueled by caffeine and adrenaline. Cross didn't waste a second. She began delegating with the cold, surgical precision of a commander who knew that a single misplaced detail could mean a dozen deaths. Morrison took point on the interagency coordination, his fingers flying across keyboards as he harmonized the disparate frequencies and protocols of the FBI and NCIS. They needed bodies, hundreds of them, and they needed them to look like they belonged in the elite circles of the special operations community. Reeves, meanwhile, was on the line with the upper echelons of the Marine Corps leadership, securing the Iwo Jima Memorial. The United States Marine Corps War Memorial wasn't just about a permit. It was about shifting the gravity of one of the most sacred sites in the country. He moved mountains, navigating the labyrinthine military bureaucracy to ensure that by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the grounds would be under their absolute control. Cross herself was calling in favors from the deepest, darkest corners of her contact list. These were the ghosts, the classified contacts who didn't exist on official rosters, but held the keys to tactical equipment, unmarked high-performance vehicles, and surveillance tech that could see through walls and heartbeats. This wasn't just a sting. It was an elaborate stage play where the stakes were measured in blood. By 5 o'clock in the morning, the first waves of agents began to arrive at the memorial site under the shroud of pre-dawn mist. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of the nearby Potomac River and the damp earth of the surrounding parkland. By 6, the transformation was well underway. The setup was nearly 60% complete, a choreographed dance of logistics that looked, to any outside observer, like the somber preparations for a high-profile military ceremony. Folding chairs were aligned with geometric perfection. Stanchions were placed to guide a non-existent crowd. By 7 o'clock, the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the bronze figures of the flag raisers. Federal agents, dressed in their finest service uniforms, stood in rigid formation. They looked every bit the part of grieving brothers-in-arms, but beneath the wool and medals, their hands stayed close to concealed sidearms. K-9 units moved like ghosts through the perimeter, their noses working the grass and the statues, while tactical teams disappeared into the wooded areas, merging with the shadows and the undergrowth. Cross stood at the base of the memorial, her hand resting lightly on Rex's neck. The dog was still, his ears twitching at the distant sound of a bird or the hum of a far-off engine. Beside them stood Torres, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the same bronze as the monument. He'd volunteered along with 8 other elite snipers from the mountain range, men who had spent their lives watching the world through a scope. Today they were dressed in Navy SEAL dress uniforms, their posture perfect, their presence lending an undeniable air of authenticity to the honor guard. Torres stared at the empty space where the ceremony would take place, his voice a low rumble. He remarked that the situation was insane. They were building a cathedral of lies just to catch men they once considered brothers. Rodriguez, standing next to him with his eyes scanning the tree line in a rhythmic, practiced pattern, didn't soften his gaze. He replied that they stopped being brothers the moment they started taking foreign currency to put targets on their backs. To Rodriguez, the betrayal was the only thing that was real. As the morning progressed, the tension shifted from the memorial to a quiet hiking trail overlooked miles away. This was the stage for the first act. At 7:45, Chen arrived at the location where he had previously met his handler. He was the bridge between the two worlds, the bait in a trap that felt increasingly fragile. Cross and Rex were already in position, buried in the same dense brush they had occupied the day before. Through her scope, Cross watched the trail, her finger resting near the trigger, her mind linked to the wire Chen was wearing. The handler emerged from the forest exactly on time. He walked with a calculated ease, the stride of a predator who felt entirely comfortable in this terrain. But as he drew closer, Cross's eyes, trained by years of high-stakes surveillance, picked up on the minute fractures in his composure. She noticed the way his right hand hovered near his jacket pocket, a telltale sign of a hidden weapon. She watched his eyes. They weren't just looking at Chen, they were sweeping the tree line in a sophisticated counter-surveillance pattern. He was looking for her even if he didn't know it. Rex felt it too. A low, almost imperceptible vibration started in the dog's chest. Cross whispered into her radio, noting that the handler was nervous, far more than he had been the previous day. The acceleration of the timeline was grinding him down, or perhaps his own superiors were tightening the noose around his neck. Chen stood his ground, his silhouette sharp against the morning sky. He told the handler he had the details. The handler stopped a few feet away, his gaze icy. He didn't want the details yet. He wanted to know how Chen had managed to move a Tier 1 memorial service on 48 hours' notice. It was a fair question. Security protocols of that magnitude didn't just shift because of a whim. Chen delivered the cover story with a chilling level of sincerity. He spoke of an emergency briefing, of the fallout from Holloway's arrest, and a wider security breach that had the Department of Defense in a state of controlled panic. He painted a picture of a military establishment trying to outrun a leak, compressing the timeline to deny an unknown enemy the chance to exploit the original date. He told the handler that the official story was family scheduling conflicts, but that everyone in the room knew it was about operational security. The handler studied Chen's face for what felt like an eternity. He was looking for the micro-expressions of a liar, the flutter of an eyelid, the tightening of the jaw. Chen gave him something else, genuine fear. It wasn't the fear of a traitor being caught, it was the fear of a man whose daughter's life hung in the balance. It was the most honest thing about him, and it worked. The handler finally asked for the location. Chen told him, the Marine Corps War Memorial at Iwo Jima. Tomorrow at 1400 hours. He rattled off the list of attendees that Cross had painstakingly curated. 53 Tier 1 operators, including high-ranking members of SEAL Team 6, Delta Squadron leaders, and the commander of Special Operations Command himself. The handler's eyes narrowed at the specificity. He asked how Chen had accessed the roster. Chen explained that he hadn't downloaded it. That would have left a digital footprint. Instead, he had memorized the top 15 names during the briefing. He offered to get the rest, but warned that it would increase his exposure. The handler told him the 15 names would suffice. As Chen recited the list, names of federal agents with airtight legends, the handler began typing into his phone. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Rex went from alert to rigid, his posture changing in a way that signaled a shift in the handler's internal chemistry. Cross saw it and whispered into the radio that something was wrong. Rex was picking up on elevated stress. The handler finished his typing and looked back at Chen, his voice dropping an octave. He began grilling Chen on the security protocols, the perimeter sweeps, the K-9 units, the force recon presence disguised as honor guards. Chen answered with the calm of a man who had seen these protocols 100 times. He told the handler that it looked like standard procedure. He was careful not to oversell it. If he had described the security as impenetrable, it would have been a red flag. If he had described it as weak, it would have been an obvious trap. He hit the sweet spot of standard, and Cross felt a momentary surge of hope as she saw the tension leave the handler's shoulders. The handler nodded slowly. He told Chen he had done well and that his daughter's treatment would be funded for the next 6 cycles. For a heartbeat, the operation seemed to be on track. But then the handler dropped the hammer. He told Chen he needed one more thing. He needed Chen to be at that memorial tomorrow, not as an attendee, but as an observer. He wanted real-time confirmation that the men on that list were actually there, that the security matched the description, and that nothing changed at the last minute. Cross felt the blood drain from her face. If Chen went to that memorial, the entire house of cards would collapse. He would see that the SEALs were actually FBI agents. He would see the gaps in the staging that only a trained eye could spot. And if he saw it, the handler would know within seconds. Chen tried to push back, arguing that his presence would be questioned since he wasn't on the official list. The handler didn't care. He told Chen to find a way, security detail, public access, anything. If Chen couldn't provide eyes-on verification, the handler would recommend a delay. And a delay was the one thing they couldn't afford. A delay meant the enemy would vanish back into the shadows, only to strike later when the guard was down. Chen asked with a voice that wavered just enough to be convincing what action they were talking about. The handler's smile was a razor blade. He mentioned a name that sent a chill through the comms. Dayati. He told Chen it wasn't his concern. Chen was just the eyes. The handler handed Chen an envelope containing auxiliary security credentials, a final piece of the puzzle that was meant to lock Chen into the trap he had helped build. After a brief, chilling speech about how Chen was a peacekeeper rather than a traitor, the kind of psychological grooming used by every intelligence agency on Earth, the handler disappeared back into the woods. Cross emerged from the brush, Rex at her side, her mind racing. It was a disaster. If Chen went, they were exposed. If he didn't, the attack was aborted. They were in a lose-lose scenario. But the situation grew even darker. Morrison's voice crackled in her ear with a sense of urgency that overridden the tactical calm. He reported that the handler had just met with 2 other vehicles. Thermal imaging showed 8 individuals, all heavily armed, conducting what looked like a final tactical briefing. They weren't waiting for Chen's confirmation to decide whether to attack. They were planning to execute the mission regardless. Chen was just a secondary verification. The gears of the attack were already turning. Cross pulled out her phone, her voice tight as she contacted Reeves. The trap was compromised. They needed a new plan, and they needed it before the sun went down. Reeves suggested replacing Chen with a look-alike, but Cross shot it down instantly. The handler knew Chen too well, the way he walked, the way he breathed. Any substitute would be spotted. She looked at Chen, who was staring at the envelope in his hand as if it were a death warrant. Then she looked at Rex. An idea, cold and brilliant, began to take shape. She suggested they abandon the Iwo Jima deception entirely. Instead of baiting them with a fake event, they would let them attack the real target, Arlington National Cemetery. They would use the enemy's own momentum against them. Morrison protested, pointing out that there was no event at Arlington the next day. It would be a normal Saturday filled with tourists and grieving families. They couldn't just shut down the nation's most famous cemetery without alerting the world. Cross countered that they shouldn't shut it down, they should flood it. Every tourist would be an agent. Every maintenance worker would be tactical support. They would turn Arlington into a living kill box, disguised as a peaceful afternoon of remembrance. Reeves called it insane, but Cross knew it was the only way. The enemy expected a staged memorial at Iwo Jima. When they found it empty, they would scatter. But if the trap was embedded in the reality of Arlington, they could intercept the attackers no matter what. And they had Rex. The dog was the ultimate sensor. He could smell the intent, the explosives, the chemical signature of a man about to commit a massacre. The decision was made. The next 12 hours were a blur of high-stakes logistics. Chen and his daughter were whisked away to a safe house, disappearing from the board for their own protection. Arlington was quietly infiltrated. It was a masterpiece of undercover work. By dawn, the cemetery looked perfectly normal, but it was the most heavily guarded 200 acres on the planet. Cross took her position at the tomb of the unknown soldier. It was a strategic choice. It gave her clear lines of sight to multiple paths, and Rex's presence there was easily explained as part of the standard security detail. She wore civilian clothes, blending into the small crowd of visitors watching the changing of the guard. Her hand hovered near the hidden grip of her weapon, her earpiece a constant stream of status reports from the 40 tactical teams hidden in plain sight. At 1 o'clock, the world began to narrow. Morrison reported 2 vehicles entering the grounds. They were rentals linked to Russian shell companies. The occupants were heading toward Section 60, where the veterans of the most recent conflicts were buried. It was a high-traffic area, a place where a strike would cause maximum emotional and physical damage. Rex tensed beside Cross, his head snapping toward the memorial bridge. He had picked up a scent, a vibration in the air that only he could interpret. Cross whispered that Rex was detecting something. A man approached the tomb, looking like any other middle-aged tourist with a camera and a backpack. He was respectful, moving slowly, but Rex's body went rigid. A low, guttural growl started deep in the dog's throat. Cross didn't hesitate. She trusted Rex's instincts over the visual evidence. She alerted the net that she had a suspect. As the man reached for his backpack with a practiced, lethal speed, Cross gave the command. Rex was a blur of fur and muscle, covering the distance in seconds. He hit the suspect with the force of a high-speed collision, taking him to the ground before the man could unzip the bag. Cross was on him an instant later, the barrel of her pistol pressed against his temple. The silence of the cemetery was shattered. Morrison's voice was a frantic staccato in her ear. 3 more suspects were converging on her position. It was a coordinated strike. The tomb was the target. Cross ordered all units to converge, her voice steady even as the world around her erupted. Federal agents shed their disguises, drawing weapons and redirecting civilians with practiced efficiency. The 3 approaching attackers realized the trap had sprung and chose to go out fighting. Gunfire echoed through the rows of white headstones, a sound that shouldn't exist in a place of such profound peace. One attacker was dropped instantly by a sniper's bullet. A second was swarmed by tourists who were actually elite operators. The 3rd suspect, realizing he was cornered, reached for a detonator. Cross saw the motion and screamed a warning. The explosion was small, a tactical charge meant to kill and maim in a localized area, but the shockwave was enough to throw Cross backward. She hit a marble headstone, the impact rattling her teeth and sending a flare of agony through her ribs. Through the ringing in her ears, she saw the smoke and the chaos. Rex was already back on his feet, his nose working the air. He signaled a secondary device nearby, an abandoned backpack that could have killed the first responders. As the smoke cleared, the full scope of the attack became apparent. It wasn't just the tomb. Reports flooded in from across the cemetery. Explosions at the amphitheater. A vehicle-borne IED at the north gate. It was a multi-pronged assault designed to overwhelm the senses and create a spectacle of terror. And then came the most devastating news of all. Morrison reported shots fired at the Iwo Jima memorial. Cross felt a cold pit form in her stomach. The enemy had split their forces. They had anticipated that the Americans would focus all their strength on one location, leaving the other vulnerable. While Arlington was being defended, Iwo Jima was being turned into a slaughterhouse. Cross didn't wait for orders. She scrambled into a vehicle, Rex leaping into the seat beside her. She drove with a reckless, focused fury, tearing through the streets of D.C. toward the memorial. When she arrived, the scene was a nightmare. The memorial, the site of their original fake trap, was now a real battlefield. 4 gunmen in tactical gear had pinned down dozens of civilians. Marine guards lay bleeding on the pavement. The attackers had the high ground, their fire disciplined and relentless. She moved in on foot, using the landscape for cover. Rex was her shadow, moving through the grass with a predatory grace. She gave him the command to clear the area. Rex didn't just attack, he dismantled the enemy's position. He hit the first gunman from a blind spot, dragging him into the open where Cross could finish the job. The second and third followed in a whirlwind of violence. The attackers, trained for traditional combat, had no answer for a tactical dog that moved like a ghost and a handler who didn't miss. Within 90 seconds, the immediate threat was neutralized. But as she knelt to assist a wounded Marine, the puzzle pieces in Cross's mind began to shift again. The gunmen at Iwo Jima hadn't been trying to maximize the body count. They had been holding the perimeter. They were waiting. Morrison confirmed her suspicion over the radio. The handler had been waiting for Chen to confirm the presence of high-value targets. When the confirmation never came, the operation had shifted from a precision strike to a Plan B, a scorched earth policy of random, chaotic attacks on military targets across the city. The handler's phone had gone dark, but the chaos was far from over. Cross looked at the list of compromised assets again, the 83 names they had been tracking. She realized they had been so focused on the 17 tactical threats that they had overlooked the quieter, more insidious ones. Her eyes stopped on a name, Michael Reynolds. He was assigned to the Executive Protection Detail at the Naval Observatory, the residence of the Vice President. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The attacks at Arlington and Iwo Jima were distractions. They were meant to pull every available tactical resource away from the center of power. Reynolds, a former Delta operator turned Navy liaison, had the access and the training to do the unthinkable. Cross raced toward the Naval Observatory, her vehicle's siren a scream in the afternoon air. She knew she was running out of time. By the time she breached the security checkpoints and reached the residence, the situation was already spiraling. Secret Service agents were in a standoff in the hallway outside the Vice President's private study. Reynolds was inside, claiming to have a dead man's switch for an explosive device. Cross pushed through the crowd of agents, Rex at her side. She looked through the window of the study and saw Reynolds. He looked like a man who had already died inside. He held a small device in his hand, his eyes wide and unfocused. The Secret Service supervisor whispered that the room had been swept that morning, but they couldn't be sure if he had smuggled something in later. Cross looked at Rex. The dog was calm. He sniffed the air at the base of the door, his tail still, his body relaxed. After a moment, he sat down and looked at her. "No explosives," Cross said firmly into her radio. She didn't wait for negotiation. She breached the door, Rex leading the way. Reynolds spun toward them, his thumb hovering over the button of what looked like a homemade detonator. Cross kept her weapon leveled at his chest, her voice a low, steady command. She told him the truth, that there was no bomb, that the device in his hand was a fake, and that his handler had already abandoned him. She told him about the men who had died at Iwo Jima because of his silence. Reynolds' resolve shattered. The fake detonator, a crude assembly of wires and plastic, dropped to the floor. He collapsed into a chair, buried his face in his hands, and began to sob. He talked about his family, about the threats that had been made against his wife and daughters. He had been a pawn in a game that was too big for him to understand. As the Secret Service moved in to take him into custody, Cross walked to the window. The sun was beginning to set over the Capitol, casting a long, red glow over the city. Her phone buzzed with a final message from Morrison. The handler had made it to Reagan National Airport. A diplomatic flight to Moscow had departed minutes before the intercept teams arrived. He was gone, shielded by the very international protocols he had spent weeks subverting. They had won the day, saved the vice president, and dismantled a massive cell of foreign operatives. But the man who had pulled the strings was already thousands of miles away, safe in the embrace of the shadow world. Cross felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She reached down and felt the warmth of Rex's fur against her hand. They had survived. They had held the line. But as she looked out at the darkening horizon, she knew the war was far from over. The ghosts were still out there, and they would be back. But for tonight, the silence of the city was a victory they had earned in blood and fire. The weight of the silence in the room was heavy, thick with the scent of ozone from the cooling electronics and the lingering, metallic tang of adrenaline that hadn't quite left the air. Cross stood near the window, her hand resting on the broad, sturdy head of the dog at her side. Rex sat with a stoic stillness that only a working animal could truly master, his eyes fixed on the door, his breathing steady and rhythmic. Cross found herself drawing strength from that absolute certainty. To Rex, the work was done, and the work had been good. He didn't care about the political fallout or the internal investigations that were currently tearing through the fabric of Washington, D.C., like a wildfire. He only knew that the threats had been neutralized and his handler was safe. "We stopped them today," Cross thought, though the words didn't quite make it past her lips. She whispered it to the empty air of her own mind, a small comfort against the rising tide of what was to come. Outside the high-security facility, the world was in a state of controlled chaos. Federal agents were swarming residences. Emergency protocols were flashing red across every dashboard in the Capitol, and the gears of the American intelligence machine were grinding with a frantic, desperate energy. But Cross knew the truth that the politicians would try to ignore in the coming weeks. Today's victory was merely the blueprint for tomorrow's threat. The network they had exposed wasn't a singular entity. It was a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive rot. Somewhere in a nondescript office in Moscow, a handler was likely already sipping tea, looking at a fresh set of dossiers, and identifying the next generation of desperate people with sick children and impossible choices. The war hadn't ended at the end of her rifle's scope. It had simply shifted into a more dangerous, more cerebral phase. 3 days later, the air at the mountain range felt thinner than usual. This was where it had all started, at the high-altitude training grounds where the world's most elite marksmen came to test the limits of physics and human endurance. The operations building was crowded, the air stagnant with the heat of 24 bodies and the hum of high-powered servers. Cross leaned against the back wall, her presence almost ghostly despite the intensity of her gaze. Rex was a shadow at her feet. She looked across the room at the faces she had come to know in the crucible of the last few days. There was Reeves, looking 10 years older than he had a week ago. Morrison, his face a mask of bureaucratic steel. Chen, Torres, Rodriguez, and Davis. There were 17 other snipers in the room, men who had watched Cross pull off a shot that defied every manual in their arsenal, and who had then watched the world they protected nearly collapse into ash. Morrison stepped to the front of the room, clutching a tablet that contained the final casualty and outcome reports. The room went silent, not just a lack of talking, but a vacuum of sound where even the breathing of 22 elite operators seemed to sync up. Morrison didn't waste time with a preamble. He laid out the numbers with the cold detachment of an actuary. He detailed the 4 attackers killed at Arlington and the 2 who were now in federal custody, their identities being scrubbed by every database from Langley to Fort Meade. He spoke of the 3 killed at the Iwo Jima Memorial and the one who had survived to be interrogated. He mentioned Captain Reynolds, now held at an undisclosed location, a man who had traded his uniform for a cell. The civilian count was read next. 11 wounded, 2 critical but stable, 0 fatalities. It was a miracle of tactical intervention, yet the weight of those 11 names hung in the room like a physical burden. 2 Marines wounded, both expected to recover. 1 federal agent with a non-life-threatening injury. Morrison paused, his eyes scanning the room, landing briefly on Cross before returning to his notes. He confirmed that the vice president was unharmed and that the assassination attempt had been successfully neutralized. Of the 83 original compromised assets, 71 had been identified. 12 remained unaccounted for, ghosts in the machine who had likely been ordered to go dark the moment the first shot was fired. The network was burned, abandoned by its masters the second it became a liability. Most of it, Reeves said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the silence. Not all of it. Morrison nodded, his expression grim. Not all, he agreed. Russian intelligence had gone silent on the operation, a strategic retreat into the shadows. Their analysis suggested the SVR would begin rebuilding within 6 to 18 months, using new methods and new faces. This victory hadn't ended the threat. It had merely bought them a window of time to prepare for the next iteration of the same war. Cross had been silent until that moment, a silent observer of the wreckage. Now she stepped forward. The movement was slight, but every eye in the room tracked her as if she were a predator entering a clearing. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried with a crystalline clarity that commanded total attention. "The handler who ran Chen," she said. "The one who slipped away to Moscow. What's his name?" Morrison tapped the tablet, and a file appeared on the massive main screen at the front of the room. The face was unremarkable, the kind of face you would see a dozen times on a crowded subway and never remember once. This was the man Cross had watched through her scope at the hiking trail, the man who had looked like nothing more than a casual traveler. Alexei Volkov, Morrison said. Officially, he was a cultural attaché with the Russian consulate in San Francisco. In reality, he was a colonel in the SVR with 20 years of experience in penetration operations. He was a specialist in the long game, a man who had been dismantling Western intelligence from the inside out since before half the men in the room had even finished basic training. Cross stared at the photo. She saw the eyes of a man who understood the architecture of the human soul, specifically its cracks. "He'll try again," she said. "It won't be the same country, and it won't be the same targets, but the blueprint will be identical. He finds the people who are already at their breaking point, people who have been pushed to the edge by a system that was supposed to protect them, and he offers them a hand. He doesn't recruit traitors. He recruits parents. He recruits soldiers who are drowning in debt or watching their children die because they can't afford the medicine the government won't provide. Volkov doesn't use ideology. He uses love." She turned her gaze toward Chen. The man was a shadow of his former self, sitting with his head bowed, his hands clasped so tightly between his knees that his knuckles were white. Michael didn't wake up one morning and decide he hated his country. Cross continued, her voice softening but losing none of its edge. He woke up and realized his daughter was dying, and the system he had given his life to serve was going to let her slip away. Volkov didn't have to brainwash him. He just had to be there with a checkbook and a sympathetic ear when the real compassion should have come from us. The silence in the room changed then. It became uncomfortable, a shifting, restless energy. Cross was saying the things that weren't supposed to be said in an operations debrief. She was pointing at the foundation of the building and showing them the dry rot. "We failed Michael long before Volkov ever stepped onto that hiking trail," she said. "We built a system that demands absolute perfection, absolute loyalty, and absolute sacrifice, but offers no safety net for the human beings behind the rifles. We act surprised when they break under the very pressure we created." Reeves stood up, his face reddening. His weathered skin looked like cracked leather. "Are you saying this is our fault?" he demanded. "Are you telling us that we are responsible for treason?" "I'm saying we are responsible for the conditions that make treason a survival strategy," Cross replied, her gaze never wavering. "You can arrest every asset Volkov recruits. You can build higher walls and write more regulations. But until you address why our own people are becoming vulnerable in the first place, you're just putting a bandage on a sucking chest wound." Morrison was nodding slowly, his eyes fixed on the screen. "She's right," he said, his voice quiet. "We went back through the files of every compromised asset in this network. Every single one of them had a documented personal crisis in the 6 months leading up to their recruitment. Medical emergencies, catastrophic debt, family tragedies. In every single case, they tried to go through official channels for help, and in every case, they were told the system couldn't accommodate them. So what's the play?" Rodriguez asked from the middle of the room. "You want us to start a therapy circle for snipers?" Cross reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded document. She set it on the table in the center of the room. "I want us to stop treating human limitations as a security risk and start treating them as a responsibility," she said. "Seknev has authorized a new initiative, Operational Resilience and Asset Protection, ORAP. The mission is simple. Identify Tier 1 operators under extreme personal stress and provide them with immediate, confidential, and comprehensive support before that stress becomes a vulnerability Volkov can exploit. Medical coverage for families, financial counseling, legal aid, whatever they need to stay focused and loyal." Torres picked up the document, his eyes scanning the technical language. "This is more than just a support program," he whispered, a note of awe in his voice. "This is a complete overhaul of how we handle operator welfare. This is everything we should have had 20 years ago. This is what 71 compromised lives and 11 wounded civilians bought us," Cross said. "The only question now is whether we have the courage to fund it and protect it when the budget hawks start screaming that it's too expensive." Reeves took the document from Torres. As he read it, the anger in his face drained away, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. His eyes grew wet, a sight that shocked the younger operators in the room. "My son is SEAL Team 3, Reeves said, his voice trembling slightly. "He has a daughter with special needs. I've watched him drown for 2 years, watched his marriage fall apart under the weight of the medical bills. I couldn't help him because I was afraid it would look like favoritism. If this had existed, he wouldn't be looking for a way out. He would just be looking for the mission." He set the paper down like it was made of thin glass. "You have my full support, whatever it takes." Morrison stepped in, his bureaucratic instincts finally aligning with the human reality. NCIS will coordinate with the program to flag at-risk operators before they hit the red zone. This isn't just about being kind. This is operational security. Every man we save from desperation is one less asset Volkov can put in his pocket. For the first time in years, Cross felt a knot in her chest begin to loosen. It was a tension she had carried since Kandahar, since the day she had watched 6 civilians die because she had trusted a system that prioritized speed over certainty. She had learned the hard way that doing the right thing often required breaking the very structures that were supposed to define the right thing. "There's one more thing," Cross said, her voice dropping to a somber tone. "Michael Chen. He's facing court-martial for espionage and providing material support to a foreign power. The current recommendation is life without parole or the death penalty." The room went cold again. Chen didn't move. He looked like a man who had already accepted his execution. "I'm requesting that the charges be reduced to unauthorized disclosure and dereliction of duty," Cross stated. 5 years in military prison, a dishonorable discharge, but he keeps his life. And more importantly, Emma's medical coverage continues through ORAP regardless of her father's status. A murmur of protest rose from the back of the room. "He gave them intelligence," someone shouted. "Marines were shot because of what he told them. Marines were shot because Volkov is a master of manipulation," Cross shot back. "Chen cooperated with us when he knew it would destroy him. He chose to do the right thing at the end, even when it cost him everything he had left. That has to mean something. If we don't acknowledge the complexity of his choice, we're no better than the system that failed him." She walked over to Chen and stood directly in front of him. He finally looked up, his face a map of grief and shame. "I don't deserve mercy," he whispered. "Maybe not," Cross said, "but Emma deserves a father who might come home one day, and that's worth fighting for." Morrison checked his phone, a small chime breaking the tension. "I just got word from the DOD," he said. "They're accepting the recommendation. 5 years, dishonorable discharge. Emma is covered. It's not a pardon, but it's justice." Chen collapsed into himself, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. Torres moved to sit beside him, placing a silent, supportive hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture of brotherhood that had been absent from the room for a very long time. Rodriguez walked up to Cross, leaning against the wall beside her. "That shot you made," he said, his voice low. 4,000 meters with a dog as your spotter. How much of that was skill, and how much was just the universe giving you a break?" Cross allowed a small, rare smile to touch her lips. "I practiced that specific shot 70 times over the last 8 months," she said. "Rex and I worked on thermal column analysis and acoustic coordination until we could hit it 60% of the time in any condition. I didn't get lucky. I was prepared for the reality of the environment, not just the data on the screen." Davis joined them, shaking his head. "You let us think it was impossible. You let us fail for 3 days. Why? Because you needed to understand that your training was built on a lie," Cross said. "Holloway had been feeding you doctored data for years. You were all calculating the math perfectly, but you were using the wrong numbers. I had to show you that your instruments mean nothing if you aren't looking at the world with your own eyes. You trusted the system more than you trusted the wind." Volkov did the same thing to Chen. He manipulated the data of his life until Michael thought he had no other options. The vulnerability isn't the person. It's the trust we place in things that can be hacked. Reeves looked at his men, his voice regaining its command. "We're changing the protocols, starting now. Every sniper on this range will learn to verify their data independently. We're going to stop being technicians and start being hunters again. And we're going to remember that the enemy isn't always the guy across the valley. Sometimes he's the one who wrote the software you're using." Morrison added his own thought. "And we're going to include resistance training for recruitment. We're going to teach our people how to spot a handler like Volkov before he ever says a word. We're going to give them a way to report it without ending their careers." Cross nodded, but her mind was already moving toward the horizon. "There's a final piece," she said. "Volkov is back in Moscow, but he won't stay there. He's too good at what he does to sit behind a desk. He'll resurface, and when he does, I'm going to be there." Reeves frowned. "Cross, you're talking about unauthorized operations. You're talking about hunting a high-level SVR officer on foreign soil. That's a one-way ticket to a black site if you get caught." "I'm talking about finishing the job," Cross replied. "Volkov is a predator who specializes in our people. As long as he's breathing, every operator in this room is a target. I'm not going to sit around and wait for him to find the next Michael Chen. The two men, Reeves and Morrison, looked at each other. A long, silent conversation passed between them, one of those dialogues that happens only between men who have spent decades in the dark corners of the world. Finally, Morrison spoke. If you were to go, it would be entirely deniable. No backup. No extraction. No official recognition. You would be a ghost. I've been a ghost my entire life, Cross said, and I'm never alone. She looked down at Rex, who looked back with an intensity that suggested he understood every word. He saved my life 17 times. I'm going to use the time he bought me to make sure Volkov never hurts anyone else. The room felt different then. The official briefing was over, replaced by the birth of something unofficial, something built on the shared bond of men who had been betrayed by the very structures they swore to protect. One by one, the snipers stood. They didn't offer empty promises, they offered resources. Torres mentioned surveillance contacts in Eastern Europe. Rodriguez spoke of linguistic experts who owed him favors. Davis offered technical backdoors that didn't appear on any official manifest. It was a conspiracy of the faithful, a network of warriors deciding to fix the world on their own terms. Reeves walked over to Cross. Officially, I can't know any of this, he said. But unofficially, I'm going to make sure the ORAP program has an international liaison office. An office that requires certain operators to travel frequently to various countries. It'll give you the cover you need. Thank you, Cross said. Chen stood up, his face red and eyes swollen, but his posture was straight for the first time in days. I can't go with you, he said. I'll be behind bars. But I can tell you everything about him. I can tell you how he talks, how he thinks, how he finds the cracks in a man's soul. I can give you the map to his mind. Cross took his hand, shaking it with a firm, professional grip. You're giving us the edge we need, Michael. Use your time to get healthy. Emma is going to need you when you get out. As the room began to empty, Davis stayed behind, watching Cross as she checked Rex's pause. That 4,000-meter shot, he said. I've been thinking about it every hour for 3 days. I still can't wrap my head around it. It's not something you wrap your head around, Cross said without looking up. It's something you feel. You have to stop trying to dominate the environment and start being a part of it. Rex doesn't calculate wind speed, he feels it. He doesn't look at thermal data, he senses the change in the air. I just learned how to listen to him. How do you carry it? Davis asked. The weight of it all, operating outside the rules while trying to save the people who make them. I don't, Cross said, finally looking him in the eye. I carry the people I couldn't save. The weight of the rules is nothing compared to that. I let you fail because I needed you to understand that the system is a tool, not a god. If you can't walk away from the tool when it's broken, you're just another piece of equipment. Davis nodded, a new kind of understanding dawning on him. He wasn't just an operator anymore. He was a man who knew the difference between the mission and the paperwork. What do you need from us? Really? I need you to be the ones who ask questions, Cross said. I need you to be the ones who trust your gut when the computer tells you everything is perfect. I need you to be the brothers that the system forgot how to be. The next few months were a blur of transition. Chen pleaded guilty in a closed courtroom. The news didn't carry the story. There were no headlines about the sniper who betrayed his country for his daughter. There was only a quiet transfer to Fort Leavenworth and a guaranteed medical fund for a little girl who didn't understand why her father had to go away, but who knew she was finally feeling better. Emma visited him once a month, her health improving with every trip. She eventually started a blog for children of incarcerated veterans, a small light in a very dark world that helped thousands of others navigate the complex emotions of love and betrayal. Holloway's fate was less kind. He was convicted of high treason and disappeared into the federal prison system, his name erased from the records of the mountain range he had spent years sabotaging. His cooperation, however, led to the dismantling of 3 other SVR sleeper cells, a small penance for a lifetime of deception. 6 months after the briefing, a message appeared on Morrison's secure terminal. It had no header and no return address. It was just a set of coordinates in Budapest and a short sentence. Volkov is active, moving on NATO targets. We'll keep you posted. Morrison didn't report the message. He simply deleted it and went back to his work with ORAP. The program was already showing results. 347 operators had been through the system in the first year. Financial crises were averted, marriages were saved, and most importantly, the vulnerability rate for foreign recruitment had dropped to nearly 0. The snipers at the mountain range were now hitting the 4,000-meter target with 88% accuracy, using the manual verification techniques Cross had forced them to learn. Torres eventually made a 5,000-meter shot in the Hindu Kush, a feat that would have been considered impossible a year earlier. When his commanding officer asked how he had adjusted for the unpredictable crosswinds of the canyon, Torres had simply looked at the horizon. "I stopped listening to the ballistic computer and started listening to the air," he had said. "A friend told me that reality doesn't care about your math." Rodriguez took over as the lead instructor at the range. His first act was to install a memorial plaque at the firing line. It didn't have names on it. It only had a single sentence: "The wind talks to those who listen." It became a rite of passage for every new sniper. They would touch the plaque before taking their first shot at the long-range targets, a silent acknowledgement that they were part of something older and deeper than the technology they carried. And somewhere in the shadows of Eastern Europe, a woman and a German shepherd moved with a silent, lethal purpose. They didn't have a flag, and they didn't have a badge. They only had a mission that the world would never acknowledge. They moved through the interstitial spaces of the global intelligence war, tracking a man who thought he was the ultimate predator. Volkov had spent his career exploiting the weaknesses of others, never realizing that the people he broke could be forged into something much harder. Cross knew that she might be hunting Volkov for years. She knew that she might never get a clean shot, or that she might end up in a nameless grave in a country she couldn't spell. But as she sat in a cold room in a Budapest safe house, Rex's head resting on her knee, she felt a peace she hadn't known since before Kandahar. The system was still broken and the war was still dirty, but she was no longer a gear in a machine. She was the hand that turned the key. The mountain range still stood at 8,000 feet, the air still thin and the targets still distant. But the men who stood there now were different. They were operators who understood that their strength came not from their perfection, but from their ability to acknowledge their humanity. They were a new breed of warrior, one that looked for the cracks in the system before the enemy could find them. And in the end, that was the true victory. It wasn't the shots fired or the enemies killed. It was the lives saved from the brink of despair. It was the realization that the most powerful weapon in the arsenal wasn't a rifle or a satellite. It was the unwavering loyalty of people who knew they weren't alone. The wind still talked, the ground still whispered, and the dogs still knew the truth. For those who were willing to listen, the world was a very different place. And for those who weren't, there would always be someone like Cross, waiting in the shadows, ready to remind them that reality always wins in the end.